They say a king never bleeds in public. They lied. Vaelor Thorne, alpha monarch of the Aurelion Empire, has conquered 47 territories, put down 11 rebellions, and survived 3 assassination attempts with nothing but iron nerve and a sword arm that doesn't know how to stop swinging. He has never asked a single soul for mercy. Tonight, someone is trying to kill him with poison so precise, so personal, it could only have come from inside his own walls. And the only person standing between him and death is a woman the Empire has been hunting for 15 years. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where my people are watching from. If you've been waiting for a story that doesn't flinch, hit like, and stay until the very last word. This one doesn't let go. The night the Empire almost lost its king began the way most catastrophes do, quietly, and in a room full of people who were supposed to be trusted. The banquet hall of Aurelion's imperial citadel stretched 300 feet from end to end, its vaulted ceilings carved from pale limestone that had been quarried from the eastern mountains 400 years ago by hands that no longer had names. 12 chandeliers hung above the long tables, each fitted with 200 oil flames that cast the room in a warmth that had nothing to do with comfort. The nobles of the empire dressed for war even when they dressed for pleasure. Silk the color of dried blood, jewels that cost more than a working family's lifetime, smiles so practiced they had ceased to mean anything. At the head of it all sat King Vaelor Thorne. He was 41 years old, and he looked it in the way that granite looks its age, not diminished by time, but carved by it. His jaw carried a week of dark stubble he hadn't bothered to address, despite the court's unspoken expectations. His shoulders had the kind of width that came not from ceremony, but from decades of actual combat, and the faint scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone was not decorative. He'd earned it at the Battle of Ireth Crossing 19 years ago, when a mercenary captain twice his size had tried to separate his head from his body. The captain had not survived the encounter. Vaelor ate nothing. He never ate at state banquets. It was a habit so old it had become ritual, and the court had long since stopped remarking on it. He sat with a goblet of water at his right hand and watched his empire perform its nightly theater. The whispers behind painted fans, the laughter calibrated to reach his ears at precisely the right volume, the toast that celebrated him in language designed to remind him, subtly, of how much he owed everyone in the room. He owed them nothing. That was not arrogance, it was arithmetic. Every treaty in this hall had been written in blood he had personally shed. Every title, every estate, every generation of inherited comfort, sitting at his table, existed because he had marched into places where sensible men refused to go and made them survivable. He did not expect gratitude. Gratitude was the emotion of people who still believed the world operated on fairness. He had stopped believing that at the age of 14, the night his father's most trusted general sold the old king's battle plans to the Vareth coalition for a chest of gold and a promise of continued estates. The general had died before sunrise. Vaelor had made that decision himself, standing in a courtyard in the rain, understanding for the first time that leadership was not a position. It was a permanent state of warfare against everything that wanted to devour what you had built. My lord. His first steward, Aldrich, appeared at his shoulder with the practiced invisibility of a man who had served in imperial households for 30 years. He was 60 now, thin as parchment, with eyes that had seen enough catastrophe to stop being shocked by it. Lord Canavar requests an audience. He claims the matter is urgent. Canavar always claims urgency. Tell him to submit the request through the chancellery like everyone else. He specifically said, through the chancellery, Aldrich. The old steward withdrew without another word. Vaelor watched the room. Lord Canavar, seated 3 tables down and pretending not to stare, was the 4th son of the Canavar merchant dynasty. A family that had grown obscenely wealthy during the empire's eastern expansion by being first into newly conquered territories with trade agreements already drafted and ready to sign. They were not enemies. They were not allies. They were what most of the court was, useful when convenient, dangerous when threatened. The music shifted. A slow ballad from the northern provinces, something about a soldier coming home to find his village gone. The court barely registered it. They were busy performing at each other. Vaelor picked up his goblet. He did not drink water. He raised it to his lips without tilting it, a motion so subtle it looked like the gesture of a man lost in thought, and set it down again. He had been doing this for 11 years, ever since the second assassination attempt when his food taster had died in convulsions so violent they had shaken the dining table. The taster's name had been Bren. He'd had a daughter in the outer city named Calla, who was now 17 years old. Vaelor had ensured her education was covered by the imperial treasury without ever attaching his name to it. He did not consider this kindness. He considered it debt repayment. The banquet continued. An hour in, the headache arrived. It began as pressure behind his left eye, a sensation he recognized and immediately categorized. He had been pushing hard for 6 weeks straight, dispatching 3 different army units to 3 different border engagements simultaneously while managing the fallout from the Merchant Guild's coordinated price-fixing scheme in the grain markets, which had put the lower districts of the capital on the edge of revolt. Sleep was a resource he rationed like everything else. The headache made sense. What didn't make sense was how fast it escalated. Within 10 minutes, the pressure had spread across the entire left hemisphere of his skull. He set his goblet down with deliberate care and pressed 2 fingers to his temple, and when he blinked, the candlelight fractured at the edges of his vision in a way it had never done before. His pulse was wrong. Vaelor was a man who understood his own body with the same clinical precision he applied to maps and campaign strategies. He knew what exertion felt like, what dehydration felt like, what the particular dull ache of a broken rib healing badly felt like. What he felt now had none of those textures. His heartbeat was syncopating, missing beats and then doubling, a rhythm like a drummer who had forgotten the count. He set both hands flat on the table. No one at the high table noticed. They were deep in a conversation about the horse races at the upcoming autumn festival, debating bloodlines and betting odds with the kind of enthusiasm that the Empire's actual crises never seemed to generate. "Aldrich," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, slightly distant, as if it were reaching him through water. The steward appeared. "Sire." "Clear the room." A pause. "Sire, the banquet is—" "Clear it now, quietly. No announcement, no spectacle. Find a reason." Aldrich had been doing this long enough to recognize the tone that did not permit questions. He withdrew. Within 3 minutes, a second steward appeared at the room's eastern entrance and announced that His Majesty had received an urgent dispatch from the Northern Military Command requiring immediate attention, and the court was invited to continue festivities in the garden courtyards, where additional entertainment had been arranged. The nobility filed out with the particular graceful resentment of people who understood they were being removed but had no standing to object. Vaelor watched them go, and he stayed in his chair because he was not entirely certain he could stand without something being visible in his face, and he refused to let anything be visible in his face. The hall emptied. Aldrich stood at the door, and Vaelor heard him say in a low voice, "Someone fetch Commander Oren. Now. Don't run. Walk." Then the old steward crossed the room to the king's side and said, very quietly, "Sire, what is happening? I need you to find me a physician, not the court physician." Vaelor's jaw was tight. The dissonance in his heartbeat was getting worse. He could feel it behind his sternum now, a stuttering that made it harder to draw full breaths. "There's a woman, outer district. They call her the Grey Healer. She operates a small practice near the Millward Bridge. Go yourself. Tell no one else." Aldrich stared at him with the expression of a man who had just been handed a task he did not understand. "The Grey Healer, sire. I will find her." "Quickly, Aldrich." The steward left at something slightly faster than a walk. Vaelor watched the door close behind him, and then he allowed himself for the first time to acknowledge the full scope of what he was feeling. He recognized poison, not from experience. None of the previous attempts had been sophisticated enough to penetrate his security at the source. But he had spent years studying the reports of the Empire's intelligence apparatus, and there was a specific category of poison developed by the alchemical orders in the eastern provinces that worked by disrupting the body's alpha resonance, the biological frequency unique to wolves of dominant bloodline, the pulse that held everything in balance. It didn't attack the body wholesale. It attacked the mechanism that made an alpha, and once that mechanism began to fail, everything else followed in cascade. The report he'd read on it 2 years ago had noted one additional detail with clinical efficiency. It was virtually undetectable in wine. It took roughly 90 minutes to reach critical concentration in the bloodstream, and it had a 0 survival rate. He had drunk from his goblet exactly once, by accident, distracted by something across the room. the muscle memory of lifting a drink overriding his usual discipline for precisely one swallow. 90 minutes. He checked the position of the candles in the hall to estimate the time elapsed. He had 40, perhaps 50 minutes left. Vaelor Thorne did not panic. Panic was a luxury, like grief. Both were real, both were human, and both were things you could not afford in the middle of a situation that required every remaining resource pointed forward. What he did instead was run calculations. Who had been near his goblet tonight? Who had prepared it? Who had access to that category of compound, which was not available through ordinary channels and required either significant wealth or significant connections within the Empire's more covert networks? The answer to all three questions pointed toward the same cluster of names. He would deal with that if he survived. He pressed his palm flat against the table and focused on breathing through the arrhythmia. Every inhale was an act of concentration. The alpha resonance that should have been thrumming steady through his entire body was flickering like a flame in a crosswind, and with each flicker, the edges of his consciousness grew slightly less sharp. He had built an empire on sharp edges. Losing them felt like watching a siege wall crack from the inside. The hall door opened. Commander Oren entered at a pace that was controlled but rapid, a soldier's version of alarm, which was not in the face but in the feet. Oren was 45, a compact woman with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness that combat veterans develop as a substitute for everything else. She took in the empty hall, the king seated alone at the head table, and something passed through her expression that she immediately locked down. "Sire." She crossed to him in a straight line, stopped 6 feet away and read his face the way she read battlefield positions. "What happened?" "I believe I've been poisoned." Not a flinch, not a shift in posture. Her eyes went flat and professional in the way a surgeon's eyes go flat when they've opened a wound and it's worse than expected. "Your physician is either complicit or a target. I've sent Aldrich for someone else. Until she arrives, I need you to lock the Citadel's internal gates. Full protocol, quiet execution. No one is to know why." "Understood. Your Grace, your color? I know what my color is. Lock the gates, Oren." She turned and was gone. Vaelor closed his eyes for 4 seconds. Just 4. Not to rest, there was no resting from this, but to take inventory. His left hand had a faint tremor. The headache had migrated to the base of his skull and was building pressure there with patient, methodical intensity. His lungs were working harder than they should be for a man sitting still. He thought about the Empire, not in abstract terms, not the flags and the maps and the theory of it, but in the specific granular texture of what it actually was. The grain distribution routes he'd renegotiated 4 months ago that had stopped a famine in the outer provinces. The medical reforms currently working through the legislative councils that would expand physician access to districts that had relied on folk healers for 3 generations. The infrastructure project connecting the mountain territories to the main roads for the first time in the Empire's history, which would take another 7 years to complete and required a continuous political will that existed because he existed. He was not a man who thought of himself as irreplaceable. Every man was replaceable. What mattered was what got replaced with. His heir was 12 years old. 12-year-olds did not hold empires. Vaelor opened his eyes and watched the candles burn and decided, with the absolute clarity that comes when the variable of survival is suddenly uncertain, that he had too many things left undone to die in his own banquet hall, like a man who forgot to check his wine. The hall door opened again. Aldrich moved quickly enough that Vaelor noted it and recalibrated. The old steward had been with him for 22 years and maintained a personal dignity that weather, crisis, and various imperial catastrophes had never succeeded in cracking. The fact that he was moving at something close to an actual run told Vaelor more about his own visible state than any mirror would have. Behind Aldrich came a woman. She was not what the name Grey Healer had suggested. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, perhaps 30 at the outside, and she moved with the particular quality of someone who had long since mastered the art of taking up as little space as possible. Medium height, brown hair pulled back without ceremony, some of it having escaped the tie and hanging along her jaw. Her clothes were practical and plainly made, dark fabric worn soft by use, and she carried a leather satchel across one shoulder that was full enough to make the strap dig into her collarbone. Her face was the problem, not its features, which were His mind registered them and filed the information without particular investment, fine-boned and somewhat severe in the way of people who don't smile as a default expression. The problem was her eyes, which were the pale gray-green of shallow water over river rock, and which looked at him with an absolute absence of the court's characteristic blend of fear and performance. She was not afraid of him. That was, in Vaelor's experience, extremely rare in the people who entered this hall. She crossed the distance between them without being invited and stopped at his side, close enough to work, and looked at him the way a craftsperson looks at a piece of work that has been damaged, not emotionally, but with focused assessment. "How long ago?" she said. Not a greeting, not a title, just the question. 40 minutes, approximately. Perhaps 45. "What are you feeling?" "Cardiac arrhythmia, cranial pressure, diminished alpha resonance, peripheral tremor, left hand only so far." Something moved in her expression. Fast and then gone. She set her satchel on the table and opened it, and her hands moved through it with the efficiency of someone who knew its contents by feel in the dark. "What did you drink?" "Wine. 1 swallow. I believe it was targeted at my alpha frequency. The compound I'm describing matches a profile I've reviewed in intelligence reports. Eastern alchemical synthesis." "You're describing Vorith silence." She said it flatly, the way someone says the name of a dangerous animal they've encountered before. "Who sent for me?" "I did." "Your court physician is not here." She paused. Her eyes came up to his. "You asked specifically for me." "Yes." "You know what I am." It was not a question. Vaelor held her gaze and kept his expression neutral, which took more effort than it should have, because the pressure in his chest was now constant rather than rhythmic, and his body was beginning to communicate urgency in the non-negotiable language of genuine biological failure. "I know what you're reputed to be," he said, "a healer of unusual skill. What you are beyond that is not a conversation for the current moment." Something sharpened in her face. "You're buying time." "I'm managing priorities. Can you help me or not?" A pause that lasted 3 full seconds, which was a long time in the context of Vorith's silence, and Vaelor understood she was making a decision that had nothing to do with medicine. He watched her make it. He watched the calculation move behind those pale eyes, the weighing, the measuring, whatever internal ledger she was consulting. Then she said, "Sit back, both hands flat on the armrests. Don't move regardless of what you feel." He complied. She placed 2 fingers on the side of his neck, just below the jaw, along the pulse, and he felt something happen that he had no category for in his existing experience. A warmth that was not temperature, a kind of subtle resonance that moved through the point of contact and spread inward, slow and precise, like a cartographer tracing the boundaries of damaged territory. Her jaw was tight. Her breathing stayed even, but he could hear from the slight shift in its pattern that this was costing her something. "Tell me what you feel," she said quietly. "What you're doing, is it? Tell me what you feel. Don't analyze it. Just report. Pressure is moving." He paused. It was difficult to describe, and Vaelor was not a man accustomed to difficulties with description. As if something is being pushed back toward an edge. The arrhythmia is, it hasn't stopped. It's slowing. Good. Her fingers didn't move. There's a second compound. They layered it. The first one opens the resonance frequency, and the second follows through the gap. Vorith's silence by itself is survivable with the right treatment. The second compound is... She stopped. Is what? Old, very old. I haven't seen it used in almost... It's been a long time. He heard something in the pause that she had not intended him to hear. Something in the phrase "a long time" that carried a weight inconsistent with a young woman in her late 20s discussing medical history. "What's your name?" he said. "Seraphine." "Seraphine." He let the word land without adornment. "How long do I have?" Her jaw tightened. "Depends on how far the second compound has progressed. And if it's progressed too far." She didn't answer immediately, and the silence itself was information. "I won't let you die on this chair," she said, and it came out with a ferocity that surprised him. Not performed, not reassuring, but genuinely angry, as if the possibility of his death were an outcome she was taking personally, for reasons she hadn't explained and possibly didn't intend to explain. He studied her face in the candlelight. She was sweating, a faint sheen along her hairline and at her temple that had not been there when she walked in. Whatever she was doing was not effortless. "You're using a significant amount of yourself," he said. "Don't talk. It divides my focus." "Understood." The next 20 minutes were unlike anything Vaelor Thorne had experienced in 41 years, including the years in which he had been stabbed, shot with 2 arrows simultaneously, thrown from a horse onto rocky ground, and survived the siege of a mountain fortress in near-zero temperatures with insufficient supplies. This was different in kind, not degree. Pain had texture and resistance. It was something you could set yourself against. What Vorth's silence did as it was being countered was stranger. It felt like watching parts of himself come back online that he hadn't realized had gone dark. The resonance returning to his pulse, the alpha frequency that was as fundamental to his identity as the beat of his own heart, didn't come back smoothly. It came back in increments, each one accompanied by a sensation he could not name. Something like regaining circulation in a limb that had gone fully numb, but distributed across his entire nervous system. He kept his hands on the armrests and stayed still. Seraphine was standing now, both hands on either side of his head without touching it, her eyes closed, her face a map of concentration so intense it looked almost like pain. Her breathing had changed, shorter and slightly rough at the edges, the kind of breathing pattern he associated with people at the far end of physical endurance. A single drop of blood ran from her left nostril. She didn't wipe it. She didn't stop. The second compound, whatever it was, apparently required more than the first. Aldrich stood at the door with the particular stillness of a man who was watching something that exceeded his categories and had decided the most useful thing he could do was remain in place and not interrupt. Commander Oren had returned and stood 6 feet away with her hand on her weapon, watching the woman at the king's side with eyes that held professional threat assessment rather than gratitude, because Oren was constitutionally incapable of looking at an unknown individual in proximity to her king with anything other than professional threat assessment. "She's not a threat," Vaelor said. Oren's expression said she was reserving judgment. "Stand down, Commander." Oren's hand moved away from her weapon. Not far, but away. The crisis broke the way fevers break, not with drama, but with a slow exhalation of something that had been wrong. Vaelor felt his heartbeat find its rhythm. Not slowly, not in stages, but in a single moment of realignment that felt like a key entering a lock, and then a steadiness he hadn't realized was gone until it was restored. He breathed in. Full breath. No restriction. He breathed out. Seraphine's hands came down. She took a single step back and pressed the heel of her palm against her left nostril and held it there with the detached pragmatism of someone managing a minor inconvenience. Her eyes opened. They were slightly unfocused for 2 seconds, then sharpened. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. Then Vaelor said, "How?" She said nothing. "The second compound. You said you hadn't seen it in a long time. You said that knowing what it was. How?" The silence stretched. Behind her, Oren had shifted stance almost imperceptibly. Not threatening, but positioned. Aldrich was very still. Seraphine reached up slowly and wiped the blood from her upper lip. She stared at it on the back of her hand for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Not embarrassment, not fear, but something closer to resignation, like a person who has been running for a very long time and has simply run out of road. "Because," she said, and her voice was quiet and precise, stripped of everything except the fact of it. "That compound was developed by my people 3 generations ago, before the Empire decided we needed to not exist anymore." No one in the room moved. Vaelor held her gaze and understood, in the particular way that a man understands something whose implications are vast and whose immediate realities are immediate, exactly what she had just told him. "Your people," he said. "Yes, the Luminar." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Even Oren, whose face was built for operational neutrality, showed something for a fraction of a second. Seraphine did not flinch. She stood in the candlelight of the banquet hall with a hand she'd just wiped blood from held at her side, and she met the gaze of the Emperor of the Aurelion Empire without lowering her eyes. "You have 2 choices," she said. "You can call your guards and do what your law requires. Or you can ask yourself why I just saved your life instead of letting you die in that chair." Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. He thought about what she had done. Not abstractly, concretely, the weight of it. She had come into this hall knowing, presumably, who had summoned her and what discovery would mean. She had stood beside the king of the empire that had ordered the extermination of her bloodline and used that bloodline's most fundamental capability to pull him back from the edge of a death he had no other recourse against. She had not run. She had not hesitated, not really. That 3-second pause in the decision had not been fear. It had been the calculation of someone choosing something they already knew would cost them. "Why?" he said. And she said, "Because letting you die would have been the easier thing. And easy stopped meaning safe for me a long time ago." It was, Vaelor thought, a more honest answer than he had received from anyone in this hall in years. He stood, his legs held, steady, no residual tremor. He was aware of Orin tracking the motion. He stood at his full height and looked at Seraphine Vale, who was 5'6" and standing in plain clothes with dried blood on her lip, and he experienced something that was not gratitude exactly. Gratitude implied a balance that had not yet been established, but was something adjacent to recognition. "Commander Orin," he said. "Sire, no arrests will be made tonight, no reports will be filed. Whatever you observed in this hall in the past hour is, at present, above your clearance level." A beat. Then, "Understood, sire." "Aldrich, the Grey Healer will be accommodated in the East Guest Wing. Full amenities, full discretion. No questions, no documentation." "Of course, sire." He looked at Seraphine. "You saved my life," he said. "That creates a debt I don't settle cheaply. You also revealed something tonight that changes the parameters of your situation in ways neither of us has fully calculated yet. I suggest we both spend the night considering what the morning requires." She looked at him for a long moment with those pale, steady eyes. "I've been calculating my situation for 15 years, she said. "I'm not afraid of one more morning." He believed her. That was the interesting part. In 41 years of ruling, he had developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting the performance of courage versus its substance. What he saw in her face was the latter, not the absence of fear, but something built on top of fear's ruins, something that had been forged in conditions he was only beginning to guess at. "Get some rest," he said. "We have a great deal to discuss." He turned and walked to the door, and the bearing he carried, the Alpha Monarch's particular way of moving through space as if the world reconfigured itself around his trajectory rather than the reverse, was entirely intact. No sign of what the last hour had cost him, no acknowledgement of the fact that without her, that walk would not have happened. He paused at the door without turning back. "Seraphine." "Yes, you should know. I read the full commission report on the Luminar purge 7 years ago." A pause. "All of it, including the sections that were classified." He left her with that. What he did not see, because his back was already turned, was the way the statement landed in her face. Like a stone breaking a surface she had kept frozen for a very long time. The slight parting of her lips, the breath that came out of her as something between a sound and a silence. What he also did not see was the moment her composure reassembled itself. Quickly, efficiently, the way someone rebuilds a wall they've been rebuilding for 15 years and have gotten very good at. But Aldrich saw it. And Aldrich, who had worked in Imperial service long enough to recognize the moment when something irreversible begins, filed the observation away behind his eyes and said nothing. The east wing of the Citadel was not a prison, but it was not a prison either. Seraphine understood the distinction the way she understood most things. Not from theory, but from practice. The room she was given was larger than anywhere she'd lived in the past decade, furnished in the Empire's characteristic blend of functionality and display. A bed wide enough for 3, hangings on the stone walls that depicted hunting scenes in dark thread, a fireplace that held real wood and real flame, and windows that looked out on a courtyard garden that was beautiful in the particular way of things maintained primarily to signal wealth rather than to actually be used. She set her satchel on the floor beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed both palms against her thighs and breathed. The second compound had taken more than she'd let him see. Luminar healing did not operate like ordinary medicine. It was not application, not the external administration of remedies against a passive body. It was resonance. It required the healer to enter the same frequency as the damage, to understand it from the inside, to carry a portion of it in order to displace it. The old masters had described it as reaching one hand into darkness and one into light, and holding both without being destroyed by either. Seraphine had been 17 years old when she'd learned that description was not metaphor. The second compound, she had recognized it in the way you recognize a sound from your own home that you thought you'd never hear again. It was old Luminar craft, corrupted, taken from their healing texts and inverted. Someone had studied what her people could do and spent considerable time and expertise reverse engineering it into a weapon specifically designed to unmake alpha resonance. The irony of it was not lost on her. She'd spent 15 years hiding the fact that she was the last practitioner of a healing tradition that had now been weaponized against the Empire's most powerful alpha. The world had a specific kind of ugliness sometimes. She looked at her hands. The blood from her nostril had dried on the back of her left hand, a dark streak that crossed the small scar at the base of her thumb. A burn scar, old and faded, from an incident when she was 11 years old and still learning control. Her mother had put her hand over the mark the morning after and said very quietly that the best healers always carried reminders of what it cost. Her mother had been dead for 22 years. Seraphine pressed her hands flat against her thighs and looked at the fire. She should not have gone. She had known that when Aldrich found her at her practice near Millward Bridge, a cramped two-room space that smelled of dried herbs and river damp, where she saw patients under a name that wasn't hers and accepted payment in whatever form people had available, which was sometimes coin and sometimes vegetables, and sometimes the simple, dignified currency of genuine thanks. When the steward appeared in her doorway and said, in the careful language of someone delivering a message they did not fully understand the weight of, that the king required a healer of exceptional skill, and specifically her, she had known that going was the end of the life she'd constructed. She had gone anyway. This was the part she couldn't fully explain, even to herself. The old reflex, the thing that had survived 15 years of careful self-erasure intact, preserved under all the layers of discretion and fear and practical survival. The fundamental inability to leave a person to die when she had the capacity to prevent it. Her sister Lysara called it a weakness. Seraphine had not seen Lysara in 9 years and did not know with any certainty whether Lysara was still alive. She thought about that in the way she always thought about it, at a slight angle, not directly. The way you look at a very bright light. The not knowing was its own specific weight, different from grief, different from fear, something with its own texture that she had learned to carry distributed rather than in one place, the way experienced travelers learn to distribute pack weight. He had read the commission report, all of it, including the classified sections. She had not known what the classified sections contained. She had guessed, over the years, from fragments and secondhand accounts, and the particular way Imperial officials changed the subject when the Luminar were mentioned, that they were substantial, that whatever justification had been offered publicly for the purge bore limited resemblance to what had actually motivated it. She had not known a king had read them. She had not known a king had read them and was still alive in a way that implied knowledge rather than having arranged for the disappearance of what he'd found. The fire crackled. Seraphine leaned forward and rested her elbows on her thighs and her face in her hands and allowed herself, for exactly 60 seconds, the luxury of not performing composure for anyone. Then she sat up. He had said they had a great deal to discuss. That was the language of a man who had already made a decision and was in the process of figuring out how to implement it. She recognized that quality in him. It was the same quality that made the court part for him when he walked into a room, not because of his size or his title, but because of the frequency he moved at, the particular gravity of a person who makes decisions and lives with them without the comfort of revisiting them at night. She had saved him. He knew what she was. He had not called his guards. These 3 facts were a combination she had not seen before and did not have a framework for. And the absence of a framework was the most unsettling thing about the night. She reached into her satchel and removed a small, flat case and opened it. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were the things she carried everywhere and showed no one. A fragment of tablet bearing a line of Luminar script in handwriting she had not seen in 22 years. A dried flower of a species that no longer grew anywhere she'd been able to find, and a folded piece of paper that she did not unfold. She looked at them for a moment. Then she closed the case, slipped it back into the satchel, and laid down on the enormous bed in her plain clothes without removing them and stared at the ceiling. The fire burned down. Somewhere in the citadel, distant, muffled by stone and weight, she heard the sound of boots moving in a pattern that spoke of an organized sweep. Orin, presumably, running whatever security protocol she had decided was appropriate for a night in which the king had been poisoned and the method of his survival was something that could not be filed in a report. Seraphine thought about the look on Vaelor Thorne's face when she'd told him what she was. Not the look she'd expected. She had expected calculation, political assessment, the rapid cold realignment of resources that she imagined was the default operational mode of a man who had spent 30 years converting problems into solutions. She had expected the face of a king encountering a useful and dangerous piece on a board. What she had seen instead was something she didn't have a clean name for. A steadiness, an attention that was different from scrutiny, less evaluation, more observation, as if she were something he was genuinely trying to understand rather than immediately categorize. She didn't know what to do with that. She had 15 years of practice at surviving kings. She did not have practice at being seen by one. She closed her eyes. Sleep was not coming. The residual drain from the second compound was too recent, her nervous system still recalibrating, but she could at least be horizontal and still and give her body the conditions under which recovery was possible. 3 hours later, as the first gray edge of dawn began to register on the other side of the curtained windows, the door to her room opened. Not Aldrich. Not Orin. A young woman no older than 19 who moved with the jerky urgency of someone barely containing a sprint. She was not a servant. Her clothes said otherwise, practical but fine, and she carried herself with the particular posture of someone raised in an institution where posture mattered. Seraphine was on her feet before the door was fully open. The young woman stopped, stared. "You're the healer," she said, "the one they brought in." "Yes. My name is Thessaly. I work for High Inquisitor Morvaine's office." Cold moved through Seraphine's chest, unhurried and specific. "I don't know that name," she said. The lie was reflex, old, practiced, smooth. "Yes, you do." Thessaly's voice was low and pressured. She glanced back at the door she'd closed behind her. "Everyone in this citadel knows that name. Listen to me. I came to warn you. I don't have much time." She stepped closer, and her face had the look of someone who has decided to do something they understand is dangerous and is moving fast to complete it before they lose their nerve. Morvaine has already started inquiries about what happened at the banquet tonight. Someone on his staff was watching the East Wing and saw you brought here. He knows the king was ill and he knows a healer was summoned. He doesn't know what you are. Not yet. But he'll have a name by morning. Seraphine held her expression still by force of will. "Why are you telling me this?" Thessaly met her eyes. "Because my grandmother was a luminar," she said. "And I have been waiting 10 years for a reason to do something other than sit in an office and pretend I don't know what I know." The room was very quiet. Outside, dawn was continuing its gray progress against the windows. Seraphine thought of 15 years. She thought of her practice by the bridge and the patients who came there, and the life she had built in the space between hiding and living. She thought of the king who had read a classified report and not called his guards. She thought of her sister, whose name she had not spoken aloud in 9 years. "Tell me everything," she said, and pulled her satchel from the floor because she understood, with the certainty of someone who had survived long enough to recognize the shape of what comes next, that the life she had been living was already over, and what came now was something else entirely. The question was whether it was the end of her story, or the beginning of a different one. She intended to find out. Across the citadel, in a chamber that the official maps listed as a storage room, and which had not functioned as such in 11 years, a candle burned at a desk covered in documents. The man who sat at that desk had the lean patience of a predator who had learned long ago that time was not an enemy, but a resource. He read the brief report in his hand with the focused attention of someone who already suspects what it says and is only confirming what he has been building toward for months. High Inquisitor Morvaine set the report down. He picked up a quill. He wrote a single name, Seraphine Vale. And beside it, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has done this before, he wrote the word found. Thessaly stood in the center of the room like someone who had just jumped from a height and was only now calculating whether the landing would hold. Seraphine looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Not a long time, but long enough to run the assessment she'd learned to run on every person who came through a door unexpectedly, a habit built from 15 years of understanding that warm faces were not always warm intentions. The girl was scared. That was real. Fear had a specific texture that performance couldn't fully replicate. It lived in the shoulders, in the slightly too rapid blink, in the way breathing shallowed without the person noticing. Tessely had all of it. "My grandmother's name," Seraphine said. If she was Luminar, she had one. Tessely didn't hesitate. "Era." She was a secondary practitioner. She couldn't do the deep resonance work, but she could read the old texts. She taught me 3 lines of the written script before she died. I've never been able to read them. A pause. "I've been carrying them for 6 years. Seraphine set her satchel down. "Say them." Tessely said 3 lines in halting, imperfect pronunciation. The consonants slightly wrong, the rhythm off in the way of something learned by sound rather than understanding. And Seraphine felt the words move through her chest like water through a crack in stone. It was a blessing. Specifically, a healer's morning blessing, the kind recited over patients before beginning difficult work. Her mother had said it every morning without exception. She looked at Tessely and allowed herself, for one unguarded second, to simply feel the weight of hearing it again. Then she put that away. "All right," she said. "Tell me about Morvain." Tessely exhaled. She crossed to the chair by the fireplace and sat on the edge of it, elbows on her knees, and spoke with the economical urgency of someone who'd rehearsed this in their head for longer than tonight. "He's been in the Inquisitor's office for 14 years. He didn't build the institution. It already existed. But he restructured it around his own methodology, which is identify threats before they become visible. Don't wait for evidence of action. Find what could become dangerous and remove it preemptively." "Efficient," Seraphine said. "Terrifying," Tessely corrected, with the flatness of someone who had seen the methodology applied. "He's been looking for Luminar survivors for 3 years. Not publicly. There's no official mandate. He runs it as a personal project through his office's discretionary resources. He has people in every district. They're not looking for evidence of power use. They're looking for patterns. People who never get sick. Healers whose success rates are statistically impossible. Anyone whose history has convenient gaps." She looked at Seraphine directly. "You were flagged 8 months ago. He just hadn't confirmed the location yet." "Yes. 8 months." Seraphine had thought she had more time than that. "And now I'm in the Citadel," she said. "Now you're in the Citadel, having apparently cured something in the king that his court physician couldn't treat, which means you are currently the most visible and the most protected and the most endangered person in this building simultaneously." Tessely's voice had a kind of grim precision to it. "He'll come through official channels first. Request an audience with the king under some administrative pretext and work toward you from the side. He won't move directly. He never does." "How long before he has enough to act?" 2 days, maybe 3. If he finds the right witness from tonight, someone who saw something they didn't understand, could be faster." Seraphine stood at the window and looked at the courtyard garden where nothing moved in the pre-dawn dark. The fire was burning low behind her, the shadows lengthening and shifting. 2 days. She thought about the life at Millward Bridge, the patient she would not see on Monday, a woman named Dara, who was 8 months along and would be looking for her midwife, a boy of 9 with a joint condition that conventional medicine couldn't address, whose mother had been bringing him every 2 weeks for 4 months, and had cried, quietly, the first time he'd walked across the room without limping. She thought about all of it and understood, in the specific way that final things are understood, that it was behind her. "You took a significant risk coming here," she said, without turning from the window. "Yes." "Why now? Not 8 months ago when I was flagged. Not 3 years ago when he started the project. Now." Behind her, Tessely was quiet for a moment. "Because 8 months ago I thought someone else would do something. And 3 years ago I didn't know enough to understand what he was building. And tonight—" Another pause, this one longer. "Tonight the king almost died, and a healer with impossible skills was brought into the Citadel, and something shifted. Something that felt like it had been a long time coming finally started moving." Her voice dropped slightly. "And I'm 20 years old, and I've been sitting in that office watching him work for 2 years. And I think if I don't do something now, I'm going to become someone I don't want to be. Seraphine turned from the window. She looked at the girl in the chair, young, frightened, carrying her grandmother's blessing in 3 lines of broken pronunciation for 6 years, and something moved in her chest that she did not examine too closely. Go back, she said. Act as if this conversation didn't happen. If he questions you about tonight, you saw nothing unusual. Can you do that? Yes. If he begins to move against me, I need to know before he acts. Can you get a message to me? I can try. Don't try. Do it or don't. There's no middle ground when Morvain is involved. You said so yourself. Tessely's jaw set. I'll do it. Then go. Tessely stood, straightened, and crossed to the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. For what it's worth, she said, my grandmother used to say that the Luminar were the only people in the Empire who understood that power and care were the same thing, not opposites. She opened the door. I believed her. She left. Seraphine stood alone in the room as dawn finished arriving outside, and she thought that it was, in fact, worth a great deal. Vaelor had not slept. This was not unusual. There were periods in his life when sleep retreated for days at a time, pushed back by the pressure of compounding decisions that kept the back of his mind running continuous calculations even in the dark. Tonight, however, it was not decision load that kept him awake. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, which was the particular alertness of a man who has been changed by something and cannot yet fully map the change. He sat at the large table in his private study, a room that existed on no official floor plan, connected to his chambers by a passage that appeared in no architectural document, one of several modifications to the citadel that his father had made and his father's father before him, and read the same page of a report 3 times without absorbing it. He set the report down. He thought about the woman across the citadel, not in the way that complicated things later. In the precise operational way he thought about all significant new variables, what they meant for the current configuration of forces, what they changed, what they revealed about the configuration he'd believed was stable. She was Luminar. The last known surviving Luminar, if the intelligence records were accurate, which he now had reason to doubt, because intelligence records compiled under the auspices of institutions with reasons to lie, tended to contain the lies those institutions found useful. She had walked into his hall carrying a secret that the Empire's legal structure treated as a capital offense. She had used that secret to save his life, and she had told him what she was with the directness of someone who had decided that the game of concealment was over, not because she'd lost, but because she'd chosen to stop playing it. That last part was what occupied him. She had a choice. She had walked in with a choice, known it, and made it fully conscious of the cost. Vaelor understood choice in a very specific way, shaped by 30 years of making decisions in conditions designed to eliminate genuine options. The appearance of choice, this or that, option A or option B, was usually a mechanism of control, a way of making people feel agency they didn't actually possess. Real choice was rare, and it was expensive, and most people spent their lives avoiding it because genuine choice required the willingness to accept consequences that couldn't be fully predicted. She had walked into his hall carrying full knowledge of the consequences and made the choice anyway. He didn't have many people in his life who did that. He stood and went to the narrow window and looked out at the citadel's outer walls in the gray of early morning. There were torches at intervals along the parapet where the night guard still walked. Their rhythm was steady and reliable, the kind of reliability that came from repetition rather than conviction, and he had always found it faintly melancholy. The faithfulness of people who were faithful because it was what they did, not because they had examined the proposition and committed to it. The door opened. Orin. She came in without knocking, which was her permanent prerogative, and stood in the middle of the room with her habitual stillness. Report, he said. No trace of the poison sourced through kitchen staff so far. Whoever introduced it into your wine had access and planning time. I've identified 4 individuals with the necessary proximity during last night's service. All 4 are currently in holding pending interrogation. Tell me the names, she told him. He turned from the window. The 3rd name, he said. Yes, Orin said. I thought so too. The 3rd name on her list was a man named Davith Corin, who was the younger brother of Lord Canavar and who had been placed as a secondary sommelier through a recommendation from the Merchant Guild's Social Committee 6 months ago, which was long enough in advance to have been planned and too specifically positioned to be coincidental. Canavar, Vaelor said. Not directly. He's not stupid enough to get within 3 steps of something this clean. No. But the Vareth coalition has been pressing him on the grain-rote concessions for 2 months. He's overextended financially. A change in imperial leadership might give him room to renegotiate terms with a less informed successor. My 12-year-old son. Yes. Oren's voice was entirely flat. Whoever advised this assumed a regency council, which would be significantly more manageable than you. He considered this. The calculation was not difficult. It was the calculation he made continuously, had made for decades. The constant triangulation between who wanted what and what they were willing to do to get it. What made tonight different was not the attempt itself, but the method. The compound that Seraphine had identified required access to Luminar alchemical texts, which should not exist anywhere accessible. Someone had them. That meant the people who had arranged this had resources he hadn't fully mapped, which was a category of information he found genuinely concerning because there were very few things left in the Empire that fell into that category. The woman, Oren said. What about her? I ran a check against the Outer District records this morning. Her practice at Millward Bridge has been operating for 11 years. No documented history before that. No birth record in the Imperial Registry under any name that matches her description. A pause with something careful in it. She's Luminar. I know. Oren held the pause a beat longer than necessary. Sire, the Sacred Dominion's mandate on Luminar survivors is, I know what the mandate is, Oren. Another pause. This one was the specific silence of a soldier who disagrees with a command and is deciding how far to press it. She saved your life, Oren said finally. Yes. That doesn't change the legal situation. No, it changes my personal obligation, which is a different calculation. He turned from the window fully and looked at his commander. Oren's face was the face of someone who was working through something. He let her work. What are you actually concerned about? Morvain, she said immediately. He has informants in the household staff. If he flags her before we've established a formal protective status, I cannot legally block his office from... Then we establish a formal protective status. Oren blinked. One single, controlled blink, which for Oren was the equivalent of a lesser person's sharp intake of breath. You're making her an official court appointment, personal physician to the crown. It's a legitimate designation. It creates standing under imperial law that places her under the protection of my household rather than the Inquisitor's jurisdiction. Morvain will understand exactly what that is. Yes. He'll respond. He will. I'm counting on it. Vaelor moved back to the table and stood looking down at the report he had failed to read 3 times. If Morvain responds to a formal appointment by moving against it, he reveals the nature of his operation and the extent of his institutional reach, which I have been trying to document evidence of for 2 years without sufficient cause to formally investigate. She gives me cause. He paused. That is a secondary benefit, not the primary reason. What's the primary reason? He was quiet for a moment. I owe her a debt, he said, and she is in danger because she's here, and I don't leave people exposed when I have the means to address it. He looked up. Draft the appointment paperwork. I'll sign it this morning. Oren held his gaze for a full 3 seconds, which was, from Oren, a form of argument, and then said, Understood, sire, and left. They met formally at mid-morning in what the court records designated as a medical consultation chamber, a room off the East Infirmary wing, small and practical, smelling of dried herbs and the faint mineral sharpness of the compound stored in its cabinets. Seraphine arrived first. She had bathed and changed. The guest room had been stocked with clothing in approximately her sesame, an efficiency she noted without commenting on, and sat in a wooden chair near the window with her satchel at her feet and her hands in her lap. She had slept 2 hours. She did not look like she had slept 2 hours. She looked like someone who had decided to be entirely present for whatever came next, which was a kind of wakefulness that had nothing to do with rest. Vaelor came in without ceremony, without guards. He closed the door behind him and took the chair across from her and sat with his forearms on his knees, which was, she would notice, The same posture he'd use with a military commander in a private briefing. Not the posture of a king at court, the posture of a man working. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Functional," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I was 12 hours ago." A brief pause. "My resonance is fully restored. No residual effects that I can detect." There shouldn't be. The second compound was the structural risk. Once it was displaced cleanly, the recovery would complete on its own. He nodded. Then, "I've signed an appointment designating you as personal physician to the crown. It gives you standing under imperial protection that supersedes the Inquisitor's office jurisdiction." She looked at him. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "No, I'm aware. You understand what it signals. To Morvain, to the court, to anyone watching. I understand. And you've decided it's worth the exposure it creates for you." He met her eyes steadily. "I've decided it's the right thing to do, which is a separate calculation from exposure." Something shifted in her expression. She looked at him the way she might look at a compound she'd expected to be toxic and had just found to be inert. Not with relief exactly, but with a careful recalibration of prior conclusions. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Then tell me. I was warned this morning, before dawn. One of Morvain's staff came to my room." She watched his face. No change, but something tightened at the jaw that wasn't there before. "She has Luminar ancestry. She told me Morvain has been running a covert identification program for 3 years. I was flagged 8 months ago. He'll have enough to move against me within 2 to 3 days, possibly sooner if he has the right witness from last night." "Her name. She came with risk already taken. I won't give her name until I understand what you intend to do with it." He looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face that was not quite a smile. Too controlled for that, but was in the neighborhood of it. "Fair enough," he said. "The other thing." She clasped her hands together in her lap, a precise gesture, deliberate. "You said last night that you'd read the classified commission report. All of it." "Yes. I want to know what's in the classified sections." The room was quiet. Vaelor leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. He had the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight and is now being asked to set it down in front of someone and describe it, which required a different kind of effort than simply carrying it. "The Luminar Purge was not ordered because your people were a threat to the Empire," he said. "The public mandate cited risks of destabilization and the potential militarization of healing power. Those were constructed justifications." He held her gaze. "The purge was ordered because a faction within the Empire's governing structure, specifically within the alchemical and knowledge management institutions, identified Luminar healing as a direct threat to their own authority. Not politically, economically. Your people could do in an hour what their institutions charged months and enormous fees to attempt, and without the loyalty leverage that their institutional dependency created." She breathed. "They were killed," she said, her voice entirely level, "because they were competition. Because they made certain people unnecessary. Yes. Level, still level. But he watched her hands and saw the knuckles go slightly white where they were clasped together, and he did not look away from it. "My mother," she said. "My mother was a healer. She spent 40 years learning her craft. She developed 3 new resonance techniques that are in the old texts that—" She stopped, started again, and her voice was the voice of someone applying controlled pressure to something that would break without that pressure. "She wasn't a threat. None of them were threats." "No," Vaelor said. "They weren't. And you've known this for 7 years." "Yes." "And the people responsible. Some are dead, some are not. The institutional structures they created are still intact, which is why I've spent 7 years building the documentation necessary to dismantle them without triggering the political collapse that a premature move would cause." He paused. "I recognize that 7 years is not a short time when measured against what your family lost. I'm not offering it as a justification. I'm telling you what I've been doing with the information." She looked at him for a long time. "You could have not told me any of that," she said finally. "I could have. Most kings would have managed this differently. A royal appointment, access restrictions, enough protection to be useful without enough information to be dangerous." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the seriousness of a real question rather than a rhetorical one. Because you walked into my hall last night knowing exactly what the disclosure would cost you, and told me the truth anyway, he said. And in my experience, that kind of decision deserves the same in return. The room was very still. Outside the small window, the Citadel's inner courtyard was beginning to fill with the mid-morning movement of a large institution at work. Servants crossing with trays, guards changing posts, the low ambient sound of an empire's administrative machinery running. "I'm not the last one," she said. His attention sharpened. "There are others. A small number. I don't know how many. I've been deliberately careful not to know, because knowing would create a connection that could be traced." She unclenched her hands and pressed them flat on her knees. "There's also my sister." He waited. "Lysara. She's 2 years younger than me. We were separated during the Purge. I was 17, she was 15. I spent 3 years looking for her and found enough to confirm she was alive, and then..." She stopped. Her jaw worked briefly. "The trail went into an area I couldn't access. Imperial detention infrastructure, the kind that doesn't have public records. Secret prisons," Vaelor said. His voice was flat in a way that was not emotionless, but was very controlled emotion. "Yes, 9 years ago I received information, indirect, fragmented, suggesting she was still alive, and then nothing." She met his eyes. "I need to know if she's alive. And if she is, I need to find her. That's not a secondary objective. That is the primary reason I haven't left this empire in 15 years, despite having more than sufficient reason to do so." Vaelor was quiet for a moment. He thought about a 15-year-old girl in an imperial detention facility. He thought about what 9 years in such a place would do to a person. He had reviewed the records of those institutions 4 years ago as part of his reform efforts and had closed 6 of them. He had not been able to close all of them, not yet, because of the political resistance that even incremental reforms generated from the people who found those institutions useful. He thought about the cost of every year he had spent building toward the right moment. Every calculation he'd made about timing and political capital and sustainable change, entirely defensible calculations that he would make the same way again if he had to, and the human weight that those calculations had distributed across people who had not had the luxury of waiting. "I'll find her," he said. She looked at him. "Don't," she said. "Don't say that if it's a thing you're offering, because I just told you something that made me vulnerable. I don't need..." "I'll find her," he said again, and his voice had the quality it had when he was not making a promise, but stating a fact that had not yet caught up to the present moment. "Not because you're vulnerable, because she's in a facility that exists under my authority, which means her imprisonment is something I am responsible for regardless of when it began or who ordered it, and because you asked." Seraphine looked at him for a long time. Something was happening in her face that she was not quite succeeding in containing. Not grief, not hope exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has been holding something alone for so long that the simple act of having it acknowledged by another human being produces a physical response that bypasses all practiced control. She looked away, out the window. When she looked back, she was composed. The composure was real, not performed. That was what he was learning about her. She didn't perform composure. She built it, quickly and from available materials, and then she used it. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Continue as my physician, formally. Whatever Morvain does next, your position needs to be visible and established before he moves." He paused. "And I need you to teach me about the second compound, not the healing application, the structure of it, how it was made. Who would know how to make it? The people who poisoned me had access to Luminar knowledge. I need to know where they got it." Her eyes sharpened. "You think someone has the old texts? I think someone has been very careful for a very long time to make your people's knowledge inaccessible, and then used a portion of that same knowledge to attempt to kill me. Which means something changed in their calculation recently. I want to know what." She nodded slowly. "I can tell you what I know about the compound, which is significant because it was theoretical when I learned it. Nobody had weaponized it yet in my people's tradition. The fact that someone did tells you something about how they approached the texts. They were reading them selectively, looking for specific categories. Offensive applications. Yes, the texts aren't organized that way. Luminar knowledge wasn't structured around offense. Anyone reading them looking for weapons would have had to have a significant amount of guidance about where to look, or have spent years mapping the whole archive. Years, he repeated. At minimum. His jaw tightened slightly. This goes back further than I thought. Most things that seem sudden don't start suddenly, she said. He stood. She stood, and they were briefly close, not inappropriately, just the proximity of two people rising from chairs in a small room. And he was aware of her in the specific physical way that the previous night's crisis had not left room for. The simple fact of her as a person rather than a problem or a resource. And he stepped back and moved to the door with the deliberate trajectory of a man who had cataloged that awareness and filed it under things requiring no immediate action. Dinner, he said, turning back. This evening, private. We have more ground to cover. In your chambers. In the map room. More appropriate and less subject to court interpretation. Something moved in her expression that might, in the right light, have been the ghost of something almost wry. The king is concerned with court interpretation. The king is concerned with your safety. Court interpretation is a secondary concern that happens to overlap. She picked up her satchel. Tonight, then. He left. She stood in the small room afterward and let herself breathe for a moment. Actually breathe without managing it, without thinking about what it looked like from the outside. The weight of the morning sat across her shoulders like something physical, and she rolled them back once and let it settle into the structure she'd built to hold it. Her sister. He'd said it like a fact, not a possibility, not a negotiable commitment. She had spent 9 years not trusting people who made promises. She had built her entire operational life around the principle that reliance was a vulnerability, that hope was a risk, that the only safe dependencies were the ones you could construct and control yourself. She thought about Vaelor Thorne's face when he said it. She thought about this classified report he'd read 7 years ago and had been working with ever since, in the particular way of a man who understood that the right time for a thing was not necessarily now, but who had never stopped working toward it. She did not allow herself to hope, but she allowed herself to consider the possibility that hoping might be survivable. That was new. The map room in the Citadel's administrative tower was exactly what its name promised. A 30-foot chamber whose walls were covered floor to ceiling with maps of the empire in various scales, from continental to district level. Some of them decades old and covered in marks from previous campaigns. Some of them current and marked with the ongoing operational symbols of an empire managing simultaneous crises at its various edges. There was a long table in the center and 2 chairs pulled close at one end, with food on a plain tray rather than court service. Practical portions, nothing ceremonial. They talked for 4 hours. It was not a dinner. It was a working session with food present, and both of them understood it as such, which was one of the things that made it work. Seraphine spread what she knew about the Luminar alchemical traditions in organized layers, the healing structures, the resonance principles, the specific categories of knowledge that the offensive compound would have required access to. And Vaelor listened with the focused attention of a man who retained information in 3-dimensional maps rather than linear sequences, asking questions that cut to structural issues rather than surface details. He was not, she was discovering, what she'd expected him to be. She had spent 15 years constructing a model of the King of Aurelion from public record, rumor, and the specific picture painted by people who feared him. That model was of a man defined by his function, effective, ruthless in the specific sense of not allowing sentiment to compromise strategy, built entirely around the maintenance and expansion of power. The man across the table was that. He was undeniably that. But he was also something that the model hadn't included. Genuinely curious. Not in the performance sense, not using curiosity as a tool for gathering information, though he was certainly doing that too. Curious in the way of someone who found the architecture of things intrinsically interesting, who wanted to understand not just the what, but the how and the why. The resonance principle, he said, at the end of a long explanation she'd given about how luminar healing interacted with alpha biology. It's relational. You're not fixing something. You're aligning with it. Yes. So when you countered the second compound last night, you weren't fighting it. No. Fighting it would have been... the metaphor that works is a riptide. You can't fight a riptide. You have to understand its direction and move with it long enough to find the angle that lets you exit it. He considered this for a long moment. How much did it cost you? measurably or in terms I can explain. Either. She looked at the table for a moment. The nosebleed you saw was the boundary breach, when I had to carry a portion of the second compound's disruption in my own resonance in order to redirect it. That's not sustainable for long. Longer exposure, and it would have started doing to me what it was doing to you. You knew that going in. I knew it was possible. And you went in anyway. I've been trained since childhood in the understanding that a healer who only takes the safe cases isn't a healer. She said it without sentimentality, as a simple operational principle. The compound would have killed you. I could stop it. Those were the relevant facts. He looked at her with the expression he'd had the night before, that quality of attention that she still didn't have a clean name for. Seraphine. Yes. I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer regardless of whether you think I'll find it comfortable. She held his gaze. Ask your sister. If she's been in imperial detention for 15 years, he stopped, chose his words with visible care. What do you believe you'll find? The question landed with the specific weight of someone asking the thing no one else had been willing to ask. She sat with it for a moment. I believe, she said carefully, that 15 years in those facilities changes a person. I've seen what 3 years does from the accounts of people who survived that long. I believe Lysera, if she's alive, is not the 15-year-old girl I lost. I know that. A pause. What I don't know is whether what she's become is something I can reach. And if it isn't, then I'll have tried, which is different from not trying. He nodded. Outside the map room's high windows, the night had fully arrived. The capital below the citadel was lit in the amber and blue of lanterns and starlight, the city's vast, irregular grid spreading to the edges of visibility. I've been the king of this empire for 11 years, Vaelor said, in a tone of voice she hadn't heard from him before. Not reflective exactly, more like a man stating a coordinate to establish position. I've made approximately 4,000 decisions in that time that would classify as high stakes. Not all of them were right. Some of them I knew were wrong in the moment and made them anyway because the available options had no clean answer. He paused. The Luminar situation is one I inherited. I want to be precise about that. I did not order it. I did not construct the institutions that executed it. And I did not benefit from its consequences in any way I can identify. But I am the king of the empire that did those things. That is not neutral ground. No, she said. It isn't. I'm not asking for... He stopped. I don't know what I'm asking for. That's the honest answer. She looked at him for a long moment. I think, she said slowly, you're asking whether I can work with you, given what I know and what you know and what sits between us because of all of it. He met her eyes. Yes, that. I can work with you, she said. I wouldn't be here if I couldn't. She paused. The other thing, what sits between us because of all of it, is something that doesn't have a simple answer, and I don't think either of us should pretend otherwise. Agreed. But working together doesn't require a simple answer. No, he said, it doesn't. They sat in the quiet of that for a moment. Then a sound reached them, distant, from the lower citadel, the specific quality of sound that experienced ears on a military compound recognize before they consciously process it, running feet, more than one set, moving with urgency rather than routine. Orin opened the map room door 30 seconds later. Her face had the expression of someone delivering information they have already classified and are presenting an operational sequence. Sire, there's been an incident in the outer district, the Millward Bridge area. She looked briefly at Seraphine. The healer's practice. Someone set it on fire. Ground floor is gone. There were 2 people inside. Patients who arrived for morning appointments and stayed when they couldn't find the practitioner. Both are alive. Smoke, not flames. Seraphine's face went still. The building, she said. Total loss. And the files, the records. Orin paused one beat. Gone. Seraphine looked at the table. She pressed her hands flat against it. The files contained nothing identifying. She had been too careful for that. But they contained something she had not been careful about because she had not thought to be. Because she had not known it needed to be protected. A series of small carved tablets stored in a tin box beneath the floorboards of the back room. Luminar script. In her mother's handwriting, gone. Vaelor was watching her. This was more vain, she said. not a question. The timing, Oren said, is consistent with a response to last night. He couldn't move against you directly here, so he moved against everything you left behind. He's sending a message, Vaelor said. His voice had gone very quiet, which Seraphine was learning was not good. He's telling you that your past is accessible to him, that hiding here doesn't protect what you had out there. Seraphine looked up from her hands. No, she said. He's doing something more specific than that. Her voice was steady, but there was a quality underneath it. Not anger exactly, though anger was there, the clean, hot anger of someone who has lost something irreplaceable, but something harder. He burned the practice to see what I would do, how I would respond. He wants to know what I value and how far I'll go to protect it. He's mapping your vulnerabilities. Yes. She met Vaelor's eyes, which means he already knows about Lysara. The silence in the room was absolute for 3 seconds. How? Vaelor said. The same way he knew about me. He's been running this program for 3 years. He had my location flagged for 8 months. If he was thorough enough to do that, he was thorough enough to build a complete profile. Her detention records would have been accessible to someone with his institutional reach. She paused. And if he knows about her, and he knows that I know she's alive... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Vaelor stood. He'll move against her to leverage you, he said. Before I can use my authority to access those records, he'll move her, reclassify her, or worse, Seraphine said, and the 2 words were perfectly level and perfectly final. She looked at the king of the empire whose institutions had held her sister for 15 years, and she held his gaze with everything she had, and she said, How fast can you move? And he said, Watch me, and was already at the door. Oren caught up to him in the corridor. The millward fire was coordinated with a request, she said, keeping her voice low and even as she matched his stride. Morvain's office submitted a formal request to the Records Division 2 hours ago, Military Detention Archives, specifically requesting transfer authority for a long-term high-security detainee. Vaelor stopped walking. The name on the request, he said. Oren met his eyes. Lysara Vale, she said, and the transfer destination is a facility that doesn't exist in any official record I can access. The corridor was empty around them. Vaelor Thorne, king of Aurelion, alpha monarch, architect of 47 conquests, stood in the stone passage of his own citadel and understood with perfect clarity that the enemy he had been building toward for 7 years had just moved first. The question was no longer whether there would be a confrontation. The question was whether he could reach Lysara Vale before Morvain made her disappear forever. And the answer to that question would determine everything that came after. The transfer request had a 6-hour processing window before it became irreversible. Vaelor understood bureaucratic architecture the way he understood siege warfare. Not as abstraction, but as physical terrain with pressure points, choke passages, and positions that, once surrendered, could not be retaken. Morvain had submitted his request through the second authorization tier, bypassing the first through a procedural classification that technically permitted it, but had never, in Vaelor's knowledge, been used for a transfer of this kind. That was the tell. A man who submits through normal channels believes his request is normal. A man who routes around the first tier believes he is operating in contested territory and wants to move before the territory can be contested. How long since the request was filed? Vaelor said, already moving. 2 hours and 14 minutes, Oren said, matching his pace. We have approximately 3 hours and 46 minutes before the window closes. Where is she being held? That's the problem. Oren's voice stayed flat, but he'd known her long enough to hear what lived underneath. The detainee file is classified under an administrative designation that maps to a facility officially decommissioned 11 years ago. But wasn't. Demonstrably not. Vaelor ran the implication forward without breaking stride. A facility operating under a decommissioned cover required sustained administrative complicity at institutional levels that didn't happen without significant backing. And people held there since official closure had no legal status anywhere in the Empire's record. They could be moved, reclassified, or eliminated without triggering any oversight mechanism. He had closed 6 facilities 4 years ago. He had not known about this one. That knowledge settled in his chest with a weight he didn't examine, because examination required time he didn't have. Power had a pathology that experienced rulers were slow to diagnose in themselves. The longer a man held authority over a large system, the more he mistook his knowledge of its visible surface for comprehensive understanding of its whole architecture. The system revealed what it wanted to reveal. The parts kept dark were the parts that served people who had figured out that darkness was operationally useful and had invested significantly in maintaining it. He had pushed against that tendency in himself for 11 years. Tonight was evidence he hadn't pushed far enough. The records clerk pulled the file in 3 minutes. Vaelor froze the authorization window under royal designation, documented the time, and sent Oren for the physical location through military infrastructure archives. Then he went back to the map room. Seraphine was still at the table. She had a piece of paper in front of her and a pen, and she was writing in a script he didn't recognize. Not the imperial language. Something older. The characters dense and precise. She looked up when he entered and he told her quickly. The transfer frozen, the location being traced, the window they had. She listened without interrupting. If she's been there 15 years, she said when he finished, moving her in under 4 hours means the staging was pre-existing. He was ready before tonight. He followed the logic immediately. The banquet was cover, not cause. He was already in motion. She wasn't leverage for him until last night. Her voice was controlled, but the effort it required was audible to anyone paying attention. Before that, she was something he was using differently. She set the pen down. Lysara was a gifted healer, better than me in some respects. More natural resonance sensitivity, even at 15. If Morvain understood what he had, he wasn't keeping her as a prisoner. He was keeping her as a resource, Vaelor said, to decode the texts. She looked at the table. Then the logic arrived at its conclusion, and he watched it land in her face. Not gradually, but all at once, the way structural failures happen. My sister has been alive in that facility for 15 years, and he has been using her knowledge to build the tools that could kill alphas. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. One breath, controlled. She would have resisted for a while. She would have... Seraphine, don't. The word came out sharp. Not at him. At whatever she was seeing. She was quiet for 5 seconds. Then the composure rebuilt itself, quickly, from available materials, the way he'd seen her do it before. I'm going with you to that facility. No. If she's spent 15 years with people using her, she will not respond to soldiers breaking down a door. She will respond to me. A pause. Or she won't respond to anyone. He looked at her. She looked back with the specific steadiness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. Stay behind Oren's line until I clear the space, he said. That is not negotiable. Agreed. Done. The facility was built into the lower level of a former logistics depot in the southern quarter, the kind of district where buildings were solid and anonymous, and people had learned that questions about what happened in which building did not improve life outcomes. Oren assembled 8 personnel, briefed them on immediate parameters only, and they moved in 2 unmarked vehicles through streets that were quiet, in the particular way of a city not yet aware of what was being decided inside it. The operation took 11 minutes. 4 cells showed signs of long-term occupation. 3 were empty, 1 was not. The guard on the sublevel was alone. Skeletal night shift. Morvain hadn't increased security here, which meant the transfer he'd planned was not tonight, but within 48 hours, probably once the administrative freeze cleared by morning. They had been faster than he'd planned for. Oren disengaged the cell lock and stepped aside. Seraphine went to the door. The cell was 10 by 8. Stone walls, a narrow bed, a single lamp burning low. The woman on the bed was already sitting up, which meant she'd heard them coming and had decided not to stand, a decision that carried its own information. She was in her early 30s, dark hair below the shoulder, thin in the way of long-term insufficient nutrition rather than recent deprivation. Her eyes were the same gray-green as Seraphine's, but with a quality Seraphine's didn't have, something dense and flat and very still, like water that had been cold for a long time and was no longer cold but retained the memory of it. She looked at the door, at the people in it, at Seraphine. Nobody spoke for 4 seconds. You came, Lysara said. Her voice was low, slightly rough from disuse. Yes, Seraphine said, barely audible and entirely steady. How long have you known where I was? The breath shift was almost imperceptible. I didn't, not the specific location. But you knew I was alive. The information I had was what? You knew I was alive. Repeated with the flatness of someone placing a stone into a wall. Methodical, permanent. And you stayed away. Seraphine didn't answer. Lysara's eyes moved to Vaelor. They stayed on him with an assessment that had nothing flinching in it. Is this the king? Yes. The king of the empire that held me here. Yes. She looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she stood, stiffly, the long-term stiffness of a body that had spent too many years in a small space, and walked out of the cell without a backward glance. They brought her to the citadel. In the vehicle, Lysara looked out the window at the city without speaking. Seraphine sat beside her without speaking. The silence between them had a texture, not hostile, not comfortable, but layered, the specific silence of two people who have 15 years of accumulated weight in the space between them and are separately calculating how to approach it. Vaelor was doing his own calculating. 15 years. The marks on the cell wall Oren had described in a brief aside. Not tally marks, but something more structured, systematic notation rather than desperation. A woman who had been used as a resource and had spent significant effort categorizing and recording what she was being asked to provide and to whom. Not broken, not passive. Something that had gone very far in one direction and become very precise in the process. He thought about what it took to maintain that precision, about the choices you made when the alternative to cooperation was something worse, and the choices you made about what you were willing to become in order to get through another day and another. About the architecture of survival when survival required you to provide tools to people who were using those tools against people like you. The cell had told him something that Lysara's face confirmed. She had not survived 15 years by accident. She had survived by becoming something with edges, something that had looked at its own damage and decided to make it useful. Vaelor had known commanders built on that same principle. Some of them were his most effective officers. Some of them were the most dangerous people he'd ever managed. He thought he understood, approximately, which category Lysara Vale fell into. He was not certain he was prepared for what that meant. Oren was waiting in his study with Davith Corrin's interrogation transcript. She briefed him while Seraphine settled Lysara in the guest suite, her voice maintaining the operational flatness she used when delivering information she found personally significant and was professionally containing. Corrin traced back through 3 intermediaries to a financial instrument controlled by the Administrative Council, the institutional body under which Morvaine's office technically operated. Not Morvaine alone, Vaelor said. Council level. 4 signatories. They've been watching your reform program build for 11 years. A 12-year-old king with a regency council drawn from institutional interests is a significant realignment in their favor. A pause. The facility's operational records link Morvaine directly to the detention and to the alchemical research. His authorization signature is on the initial research mandate. The logs document the full development of the weaponized compounds. They're in Luminar script in some sections, transcribed in others. Lysara's work, he said. Yes. He looked at the folder for a moment. 15 years of research logs. A woman transcribing her own people's healing knowledge into weapons. He thought about the specific psychological cost of that, what you had to do to the part of yourself that understood what you were producing in order to keep producing it, what you had to build over that part to continue functioning, how those structures, once built, became load-bearing. Arrest order for Morvaine, he said. Council suspension. Documentation package through proper channels before sunrise. Full audit on Canavar's network. Oren nodded and left. He sat alone for a moment with the arithmetic of the night. He had been wrong about the pace, wrong about how much time he had, wrong about the extent of what had been operating in the dark while he was building toward the right moment. That was the honest accounting, and he made it without flinching because flinching didn't change the numbers. The right moment had been a useful fiction that the Administrative Council had been planning around for years. He filed that information where it belonged and stood. Lysara was still awake when he knocked. Seraphine opened the door and he saw, in the brief look she gave him, that things in the guest suite had not been uncomplicated. He didn't ask. He looked past her at Lysera, who was sitting in the chair by the window in plain clothes too large for her, and said, "I'd like to speak with you both." They sat in the small room, Lysera in the chair, Seraphine on the edge of the bed, Vaelor standing because the room didn't have space for three people seated comfortably, and he preferred the position anyway. He told them about Corin, about the council, about the documentation case, and the arrest order going out at first light. Lysera listened to all of it. Then she said, "You're building a legal case." "Yes." "Through proper channels, documented, defensible, sustainable." "Yes." "How long will that take?" "The immediate arrests and suspensions happen at dawn. The full investigation and prosecution," he paused because honesty required it, "months, possibly longer for the full council." She looked at him with those flat, dense eyes. "And the other facilities?" He was still. "There are others," she said. It was not a question. "I heard them talk, not often, not carelessly. But 15 years is a long time, and people stop watching what they say in front of a prisoner eventually. There are 11 other Luminars in custody across 3 separate locations." She paused. "Morvain doesn't need all 4 council votes to move them. He only needs one facility administrator who understands what's about to happen and decides to act before the arrest order arrives." The room was quiet. Vaelor looked at her and understood that what she was giving him was not new intelligence. She had been holding this specific information and delivering it at this specific moment because she understood leverage, because 15 years in an institution that ran entirely on leverage had made her fluent in its grammar. She was telling him the case was not as solid as he thought. She was telling him there was a gap between the legal process and the people in those facilities, and that the gap could be closed before morning if Morvain moved. "I have teams that can move tonight," he said. "Do you have the locations?" "Not yet." "I do," she said. Seraphine made a sound. Not quite a breath, not quite a word. Vaelor looked at her briefly. She was watching her sister with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Something that was not entirely readable. Something that held more complexity than any single word could carry. "Give me the locations," Vaelor said to Lysera. "We move simultaneously, every facility, same hour, before Morvain's people can coordinate a response." Lysera looked at him for a long moment. "You'll close them all," she said. "Not transfer. Close." "Yes." "And the people responsible for running them? Prosecuted under the same documentation package." "That's a promise from the king of the empire that held me in a cell for 15 years, she said, and her voice was entirely without effect, stating a fact rather than making an accusation. "You understand why I'm assessing the weight of that carefully." "I understand. Seraphine trusts you," she said. "I don't know you well enough to trust you, but I know that my sister doesn't give that away without reason, and I have been wrong about very few things in the last 15 years because I couldn't afford to be wrong." She paused. "So I'll give you the locations, and I'll watch what you do with them." She gave him the locations. 3 facilities. Specific designations, approximate layouts based on what she'd heard described, names of the administrators she'd cataloged over 15 years of careful listening. He took the information, filed it into operational order in his mind, and went to find Orin. The corridor was empty and quiet and cold in the way of stone buildings at the deepest hour of the night, and Vaelor walked it with the particular sense that the night was almost done. Not finished, not resolved, but past the point where the darkness was heaviest. He found Orin at the end of the corridor. Her expression stopped him. He had known Orin for 20 years. He knew every register of her face, every degree of the professional neutrality she maintained, and what he saw now was something outside the normal range, something in the neighborhood of a soldier who has found the situation outside the parameters they were given and is deciding how to report it. "The arrest team went to the visitor wing," she said. He waited. "Morvain isn't there. He left the Citadel 2 hours ago, before the frozen transfer request, before we reached the depot." She held out a folded paper. "There's a message." He took it. 3 lines. A precise hand. The confidence of a man comfortable with his current position. "You found one. I have already moved the others. 11 surviving Luminars across facilities you will not reach in time. Release the council. Suspend the investigation. Or by morning, they cease to be a question worth asking." He read it twice. He set it down. The room rearranged itself around that message. Every calculation he had run in the last 3 hours rearranged itself. The arrest order, the documentation package, the simultaneous facility operation he'd been mentally drafting, all of it running into the hard wall of this single fact. Morvain had been ahead of him, not by much, but by enough. This was the particular architecture of a threat designed by someone who understood the specific shape of the man receiving it. It was not leverage over Vaelor directly. It was leverage over the people Vaelor had just committed to protecting, and it was structured so that the legal, the careful, the properly documented path led directly to those people being used as the instrument of their own destruction. Release the council, suspend the investigation, surrender the case. Let the people responsible walk free with full confirmation that the king of the empire could be stopped with 11 lives placed in the right position. Or don't. And live with what that cost. He thought about the empire he was trying to build. He thought about what direction of travel looked like when the direction was being used as a mechanism against the people it was supposed to reach. He thought about Lysara in a 10-by-8 cell for 15 years, building a map she intended to give someone when they came, because she believed someone would come. He thought about the specific kind of faith required to build a map for 15 years in a cell. He thought about what it would mean to tell her that the map wasn't enough. Oren was watching him. He folded the message and put it in his coat. "Find Seraphine," he said. "Find Lysara. Bring them to the map room." "Sire." Oren's voice had the careful quality of someone about to say something they've measured precisely. "If you don't comply, he moves against 11 people before dawn. If you do comply, you lose the case, and the council walks free, and this happens again, in 5 years or 10, with different people in different cells." She paused. "There is no clean option here." "I know. What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to stop making decisions that assume I have more time than I do." He walked to the map room. Dawn was 40 minutes away. Outside the high windows, the city was still dark, still running its quiet routines beneath a sky that hadn't yet decided to change. Millions of lives in the spaces his decisions shaped. The distance between a king's intentions and what those intentions actually protected measured in exactly this kind of night. He stood at the window and he let himself be fully in it. Not the strategic version of the situation, not the legal version, not the version that fit inside the architecture of careful, sustainable, properly documented change. The raw version. A man who had built an empire on the principle that the right way to do a thing was the only way worth doing, standing in a room with a message that had just demonstrated the cost of that principle in terms he could not abstract away. 11 people. Morvain had moved them already, or said he had. The threat was real enough to act on and unverifiable enough to be used either way. The door opened. Seraphine came in first. She read his face in the way she had from the beginning, not slowly, not with commentary, but with the immediate accuracy of someone who had spent a long time learning to read situations faster than the situations could change. "What happened?" she said. He handed her the message. He watched her read it. He watched the moment it landed, the slight arrest of breath, the stillness that moved through her like cold through water, and then the controlled exhale and the stillness that came after, which was not the stillness of someone who had accepted a thing, but of someone who had looked at it fully and was deciding what to do next. Lysara read it over her shoulder. She made no sound, no visible response. She simply handed it back and looked at Vaelor with those flat, precise eyes and said, "He moved them before you froze the transfer, which means he was watching the citadel, which means someone inside gave him the signal." The room got very quiet. Vaelor held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "You have a problem inside your own walls," she said. "You have had it for at least as long as you've been working toward this case, possibly longer." He didn't deny it. "I know," he said. "Then you understand," she said, "that the carefully documented legal approach has a vulnerability it can't close." "I understand that." "And you understand that the 11 people in those facilities are going to be moved or worse before your documentation reaches a court." "I understand that too." "Then what," she said, "are you going to do about it?" He looked at her. He looked at Seraphine, who was watching him with an expression that had no performance in it, just direct, present attention, The same attention she'd had the night she walked into his hall. The attention of someone who had already decided to be fully in this and was waiting to see what he was made of. He thought about the king he had been, patient, strategic, building toward the right moment. He thought about the message in his pocket. He thought, the right moment is being used against you. He said, we do this differently. Lysera's eyes didn't change. How differently, she said. Differently enough that Morvain can't predict it, he said, which means I stop doing what he expects a king to do. He looked at Oren in the doorway. You said no clean options. Yes, Oren said. There's one option you didn't name. Which one? Go through the inside problem directly. Use the person inside to feed Morvain false positioning. Make him believe the king is complying while we move on the facilities simultaneously from positions he hasn't mapped. He paused. It's not legal. It's not documented. It's the kind of operation that doesn't appear in any record. Oren was very still. You're describing running a deception operation against your own institution, she said. Yes. If it's discovered, I know the exposure. It compromises everything you've built. Only if we're discovered, and only if what we've built can't survive a king doing what was necessary, when necessary, was the only remaining option. He looked at all of them. I spent 7 years being careful. I spent 7 years building toward the right moment. Tonight, the right moment was used as a weapon against 11 people. His voice was quiet, but it had the quality it had at the map table, the quality of something that has arrived at a conclusion and will not be argued away from it. I'm done waiting for a moment that won't be used against the people I'm trying to protect. Seraphine looked at him. She said, tell us what you need. And Lysera, after a moment, said the same. Dawn was 30 minutes away. The king of Aurelion turned from the window, and the person who turned was not precisely the same as the person who had stood there a minute before. Something had shifted, something irrevocable, the way a bone sets differently after it's been broken and healed. Not worse, not better. Different in the specific way of something that has been tested past its original limits and has found, in the breaking, a new structural principle. He was still a king, but he was no longer the king who believed that patience alone was sufficient protection for the people under his care. That king had run out of road. What came next would have to be something else entirely. The deception operation had 1 hour to work before dawn made it irrelevant. Vaelor stood at the map table with Lysera across from him, and she was drawing from memory, not hesitantly, not with the approximations of someone reconstructing uncertain recollections, but with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years turning overheard fragments into a complete architectural diagram and was now delivering it at speed. 3 facilities. Specific locations. Guard rotations she'd extracted from administrative conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. Entry points. Structural layouts described with the accuracy of someone who had cataloged everything because she understood that information was the only currency available to a person with nothing else. Vaelor watched her draw and understood something about her that he had been only partially seeing until now. She had not survived 15 years by enduring. She had survived by becoming necessary, by making herself the most useful person in any room she occupied, not out of compliance, but out of the tactical understanding that necessity was a form of protection, that people did not eliminate resources they depended on. She had given them what they asked for, and she had taken from them, invisibly, everything they said and did and revealed in her presence, and she had built it into a weapon she intended to use when the moment arrived. The moment had arrived. The question of what that kind of survival cost, what it did to the internal architecture of a person, what walls it required building, and what it left no room for, was a question that did not belong to this hour. It belonged to later, to the slower work of whatever came after. Right now what mattered was that her map was accurate, and he believed it was, because it had the texture of truth that only first-hand knowledge produces. The inside contact, Lysera said, without looking up from the map. Do you know who it is? I have a strong candidate, Vaelor said. Then use them now. Whatever you're going to feed Morvain, it needs to reach him in the next 20 minutes, or he's already moving. He looked at Oren. Oren said, Aldrich. The name landed in the room with a specific weight. Seraphine looked up from the corner where she had been standing quietly, watching the map take shape. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. the slight recalibration of someone adjusting to new information while keeping their face still. Vaelor had known Aldrich for 22 years. He had known Aldrich for 22 years, and the man had stood at the door of the banquet hall on the night of the assassination attempt and directed the room to be cleared and sent for the physician the king had asked for. And every action had been correct, and every action had also provided a complete account of what had happened that night to whoever Aldrich reported to. "How long?" Vaelor said. "The financial trail goes back 9 years," Oren said. "Small payments, irregular intervals, through 3 layers of accounts. I found it 2 hours ago while running the Corin audit. I should have found it sooner." "You found it when the investigation gave you cause to look in that direction. Before that, there was no reason to look." He said it without softening and without harshness, because it was true, and because blame without purpose was a waste of time he didn't have. "Where is he now?" "His quarters. He doesn't know we have the trail." "Good. I need him to send one message." He looked at the map. "Tell Morvain that the king has decided to comply, that the documentation package is being suspended and the arrest order withdrawn, that the king is requesting a private meeting at the Celestial Sanctum at dawn to confirm the terms of the agreement." Oren understood immediately. "You're drawing him out. He won't move the prisoners until he has confirmation of compliance. He's careful. He'll want to see the withdrawal documented before he releases the leverage. That gives us the window." He looked at the 3 facility locations on the map. Simultaneous extraction. All 3, same hour, 45 minutes from now. Before he realizes the meeting is false, and before he can reach any of the administrators. "I need 6 teams, Oren said. "You have 8 people." "I know. They'll be split thin." "Can it be done?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be an honest assessment rather than a reflexive answer. "Yes," she said. "Then do it." Oren left at something faster than a walk. Vaelor looked at the map. Lysara had stepped back from the table and was watching him with those flat, measuring eyes. He had the sense, not for the first time tonight, of being assessed by someone who had very precise instruments and was running a very complete evaluation. "The Celestial Sanctum," Seraphine said. Her voice was careful in the way of someone who recognizes a name they weren't expecting to hear. "That's where you're meeting him." "That's where I'm drawing him. That's the birthplace of the Luminar lineage." She met his eyes. "You chose that location." "I chose it because it's outside the Citadel's administrative infrastructure, which means it's outside the space Morvain controls. And because it's a location that means something to him, he'll understand it as either a concession or a provocation, and either way he'll come." He paused. "And yes, because I am done pretending that the history of what happened to your people is something to be managed at a careful distance." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm coming with you." "I know. You were going to tell me not to." "I was," he said. "I decided not to." Something moved in her face that was almost in the right light, something like the beginning of a different kind of trust. Not the provisional trust she'd been extending since the banquet hall, calibrated and conscious, but something less calculated, something that had arrived without being fully authorized. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Aldrich sent the message. Vaelor watched through Oren's operative as the old steward read the drafted text, his face entirely composed, and wrote it out in his own hand without deviation or addition, which was the behavior of a man who had been doing this long enough to understand that improvisation was how intermediaries got caught. He sealed it and sent it through a channel that had nothing to do with the Citadel's standard communication infrastructure, which was confirmation enough. Vaelor did not go to confront Aldrich before leaving. There was a logic to that decision that some would have questioned. 22 years of service, and the king walks past his quarters without a word. But the logic was this. Aldrich had given 9 years of information to the administrative council, and the council had tried to use it to kill the king in his own banquet hall. And the appropriate response to that was not a conversation in a corridor at 4 in the morning. It was documentation, due process, and a prosecution that would stand up to every procedural challenge Morvain's lawyers could construct. The emotional version of the reckoning could wait. The institutional version could not afford to be done badly. This was the discipline that separated a ruler from a man acting on personal injury. Vaelor had made that separation his operational principle for 11 years. Tonight it cost him something specific. The closure, the confrontation, the simple human satisfaction of looking a man who had betrayed him in the eyes and letting him understand what that had cost. And he paid that cost and moved forward. He was learning, in the compressed hours of this particular night, something about the relationship between patience and urgency that he had not fully understood before. He had treated patience as a virtue with no ceiling. The right move, applied long enough, would eventually produce the right result. What tonight had demonstrated was that patience had a failure mode, and the failure mode was the space it left for other people to act in. The gap between now and the right moment was not empty. It was occupied by the people who found that gap operationally useful and had no interest in waiting for the right moment to arrive. Speed was not the opposite of patience. Speed was what you deployed when patience had run its course. He put on his coat, checked the blade at his side, not ceremonial, not symbolic, a weapon he knew how to use because he had used it, and went to meet the man who had tried to have him killed. The Celestial Sanctum sat at the edge of the capital's oldest district, a structure that had been ancient before the Empire was built and had outlasted 3 dynasties by the simple virtue of being built from stone that refused to cooperate with decay. Its towers were partially collapsed, the eastern wall open to the sky. The interior, a vast space of broken columns and cracked flooring, where something had once been practiced that the Empire's official history had spent decades trying to make abstract and distant. It was not abstract to Seraphine. She walked the perimeter of the inner chamber while Vaelor's remaining personnel took positions in the shadows of the outer walls, and the feeling of the place moved through her in a way that had nothing to do with mysticism and everything to do with memory encoded in the body rather than the mind. Her mother had spoken of this place. Her earliest teachers had spoken of it. The script she'd been writing in the map room, the morning blessing in her mother's tradition, had originated here, in this space, in the hands of people whose names she still carried. The Empire had tried to make them hypothetical. She was standing in their birthplace at 4:30 in the morning, about to face the man who had held her sister captive for 15 years, and she was the least hypothetical thing in the world. "He'll come from the north entrance," Vaelor said quietly beside her. "Morvain is methodical. He'll want the high ground on approach, and he'll bring people, well, not many because he believes this is a negotiation, and bringing too many reeds is weakness, but enough." He looked at her. "When he arrives, say nothing. Let me work him. If he moves toward you, I'll handle it." Seraphine. "I've been handling myself for 15 years. She met his eyes. "Let me work." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Don't let him make you angry. He'll try." "I know. He's been studying you since you were flagged 8 months ago. He knows what buttons to push." "So do I," she said. "I've been studying what he did to my sister for 8 months longer than that." Vaelor looked at her with that expression that she still didn't have a clean name for, the one that was not admiration exactly, not assessment exactly, but something that occupied the space between those things. The expression of someone encountering a person who consistently turns out to be more than the estimate suggested. Then they heard footsteps on the north approach. Morvain was 60 years old and looked 50, in the specific way of men whose inner lives were organized around control and whose bodies, finding nothing to resist, had maintained themselves efficiently. He was not large. He had the presence of someone who had learned long ago that presence was manufactured rather than inherent, and had invested accordingly. The particular stillness, the economy of movement, the eyes that moved across a room, and catalogued it before the face registered anything. He came with 4 people, 2 positioned at the outer entrance, 2 flanking him at a distance that communicated professional threat assessment without overt aggression. He looked at Vaelor first, then at Seraphine. His expression did not change, but something in it reconfigured. A very slight, very controlled acknowledgement, like a man finding a piece on the board he hadn't placed there himself. "You brought her," he said. "She goes where she chooses," Vaelor said. "That's the difference between my household and yours." Morvain looked at the ruins around them, at the broken columns and the open sky. He looked at the cracked flooring beneath his feet, and something passed through his face that was brief and dense and difficult to categorize. Not regret. Nothing as human as regret. More like the expression of a man encountering the evidence of his own past work and finding it satisfactory. "This is a significant location for a negotiation," he said. I thought so too, Vaelor said. You're not here to negotiate. Morvaine's voice was entirely conversational. The compliance message was a construct. You've been running an extraction operation for the past 40 minutes. He looked at his watch, an actual watch, the gesture of a man measuring something. By my estimate, your teams are at the facilities now or approaching. You're hoping to reach the 11 before I can give the order to move them. The air in the space had the quality of something pulled very tight. Vaelor didn't confirm or deny. He held Morvaine's gaze with the stillness of someone who was done being readable. Here's the problem, Morvaine said. I gave the order 2 hours ago. Not contingent on your compliance. Not contingent on any communication from inside your citadel. Contingent on sunrise. He paused. Which is in 11 minutes. Seraphine felt the words move through her chest like cold water. Vaelor's face didn't change. You're lying, he said. I have never needed to lie to you, Morvaine said with the patience of someone who has thought this through completely. I have simply been more thorough than you believed possible. The 11 were moved at 2 this morning, before your team reached the depot, before you froze the transfer request. They are currently in transit to a location that is not on any map your commander has access to. He looked at Seraphine. I want you to understand that this was not about you specifically. The Luminar survivors are a resource. Resources are moved when conditions require it. Your arrival at court simply accelerated the timeline. Seraphine said nothing. She was aware of her own heartbeat. Not racing, not erratic, but very present. A steady pressure behind her sternum that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the effort of staying exactly where she was instead of closing the distance between herself and this man. She thought about Lysera in a 10-by-8 cell for 15 years. She thought about the morning blessing in her mother's handwriting, burned in a building on Millward Bridge. She thought about 11 people in transit to a location that wasn't on any map. She breathed. Release them, she said. Her voice came out level. Not loud, level in the way of something that has been compressed to its essential structure. Morvaine looked at her with the expression of a scientist observing a specimen behave as predicted. I'm afraid that's not... Release them, she said again, not as a request, as the only option that ends this without destroying everything you've built. Something shifted in his expression. Fractionally. The first genuine shift since he'd entered the space. You're threatening me, he said. I'm informing you, she said. There's a difference. A threat implies uncertainty about the outcome. I'm not uncertain. Vaelor had gone very still beside her. Morvaine studied her face. Whatever he saw there moved something behind his eyes. Not fear, but the specific alertness of someone who has just recalibrated their assessment of a variable. What are you going to do? He said. I'm going to do what my people have always done, she said. I'm going to heal something. She placed both hands flat against the cracked stone floor of the celestial sanctum, and she opened everything. This was different from what she had done in the banquet hall. That had been precise, targeted, a surgical intervention against a specific compound in a specific body. What she did now was neither surgical nor targeted. It was the full expression of a resonance capability she had spent 15 years keeping at barely a fraction of its actual scale. And the difference between the fraction and the whole was the difference between a candle and a fire. The luminar resonance did not operate like force. It operated like frequency. It found the living systems around it, and it aligned with them, all of them simultaneously, and through that alignment, it read them with a completeness that had no equivalent in any other discipline. She felt Vaelor beside her, his alpha resonance steady and strong, the rebuilt frequency she had aligned 2 nights ago, humming at full capacity. She felt the 4 people Morvaine had brought, their fear, their readiness, the physical tension of people waiting for a signal. She felt Morvaine, and what she felt in him stopped her, not stopped her ability. The resonance was running fully. She couldn't have pulled it back in that moment if she'd tried. What it stopped was her certainty about what she intended to do with it. Because what she felt in Morvaine was not the architecture of a predator. It was the architecture of someone who had been afraid for a very long time. Afraid of exactly what she represented. Afraid with the specific, corrosive fear of a man who had decided decades ago that the only protection against an uncertain world was absolute control, and who had built that control structure so completely around himself that there was no longer a meaningful distinction between the man and the mechanism. She understood, in the full resonance of it, that she was not facing a monster. She was facing a person who had made a choice. The choice that fear always offered. The choice to eliminate what you couldn't control rather than learning to live alongside it. And had made it so completely and so long ago that he no longer recognized it as a choice. He experienced it as reality, as the only rational response to the facts of existence. That understanding did not make her merciful, but it made her precise. She focused the resonance to a single point, and she found the communication mechanism. The signal he'd described, the order contingent on sunrise, whatever technological or human chain he'd established to trigger the movement of the 11 prisoners. And she traced it through the frequency of his body, the way she had traced the Vorith compound 2 nights ago, following the thread of it through the architecture of his attention, finding where it lived. Morvaine's hand went to his coat. The 2 flanking personnel moved. Vaelor moved faster. He crossed the distance between himself and the nearest flanking guard in the time it took the man to register the motion and attempt a response, and what followed was not complicated. It was the application of 30 years of combat training against a person who had significantly less, and the outcome was not in question from the first contact. The guard went down. The second one turned and met Orin, who had materialized from the shadows of the outer wall with the particular efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had spent the waiting time positioning herself optimally. Morvaine got his hand inside his coat. He pulled out not a weapon but a small device, mechanical. A trigger mechanism of some kind, the kind of thing that sent a signal through a predetermined channel. Seraphine hit him with the full redirected force of the resonance. Not damaging. She was not built to damage. That was not what the capability was for. It was the deepest truth of everything her people had ever understood about their own power, that the capacity to align with living systems was incompatible with the intention to destroy them. What she did was closer to what you did to a flame in a high wind. You didn't fight the wind, you surrounded the flame with something that the wind couldn't reach. She surrounded the signal. She wrapped the frequency of the mechanism's channel in the full resonance of the celestial sanctum stone beneath her hands, which had absorbed generations of luminar practice and retained the harmonic like a bell retains the memory of having been struck, and she redirected it. Not blocked, redirected. The signal went out. It went out exactly as Morvaine had configured it. It went out through every channel he'd established, and it arrived at every endpoint he'd prepared. And it said, "Stand down." Morvaine looked at the device in his hand. He looked at Seraphine on the floor of the sanctum, both hands against the stone, her head bowed, sweat at her temples and blood at her nostril again, because this had been significantly larger than the banquet hall, and her body was registering the fact. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face yet. It was something very close to fear. Not of her specifically, of the thing she had just done, the demonstration of a capability that his 15-year systematic effort to catalog and contain and weaponize had apparently not fully mapped. He had studied the Luminar text for 15 years through the work of an unwilling practitioner. He had built compounds and strategies and an entire institutional apparatus around his understanding of what they could do. He had not understood this. "That's not possible," he said. "The resonance capability doesn't extend to..." "To what?" Seraphine lifted her head. She was tired, bone-deep tired, the specific exhaustion of having opened to the full extent of herself and run everything through it at once. Her voice was rough at the edges. "To what my people actually were? Or to what you decided they were, based on the sections of the text your prisoner was willing to let you have?" Something crossed his face. Slow, dense. She watched him understand it. Lysara had been curating what she gave him. 15 years of forced transcription, and she had been deciding, quietly, invisibly, what to include and what to withhold, building his understanding of Luminar capability around a version that was detailed enough to be credible and incomplete enough to leave exactly this gap. His most valuable resource had been running her own operation inside his. "The 11, Vaelor said. He was standing over the unconscious guard, and his voice had the quality it had when he was not making a statement but placing a marker into the ground that would not be moved. Morvaine looked at him. "Their locations," Vaelor said. "Now. Not the facilities, the actual locations of the transports. You have them. You always have them. Because a man who runs this kind of operation doesn't delegate the position of his leverage. He carries it. Morvain said nothing. The signal has already gone out, Vaelor said. Whatever you plan to trigger at sunrise has been redirected. Your people at those facilities have been told to stand down. Your teams in transit are now operating without instruction. He stepped forward. In approximately 30 minutes, your entire network is going to be running without central coordination for the first time in 15 years. Because I have your communication chain, and you have nothing left to offer anyone in it as an alternative to what I'm about to offer instead. Morvain's jaw was tight. You're offering amnesty, he said. I'm offering the people in your network the choice between cooperation and prosecution. That's not amnesty. That's arithmetic. Vaelor stopped 2 feet away. The difference between you and them is that they still have a choice in front of them. You made yours a long time ago. Something moved in Morvain's face. Not surrender. He was not a man built for surrender, and Seraphine understood that even now, at the far end of everything, he was calculating rather than capitulating. But something else. Something that was the expression of a man who has reached the end of a strategy he has run for 15 years and is standing in the space where the strategy ends and there is nothing behind it. This was the psychological reality that power without accountability always arrived at eventually. The architecture of absolute control was structurally brittle. It looked impregnable from the outside because it had eliminated all visible opposition, but it had done so at the cost of eliminating everything that would have told it where its own limits were. Morvain had spent 15 years removing every obstacle to his operation, and in doing so had removed every mirror that might have shown him what he was building toward. He had arrived here, the ruins of the birthplace of the people he'd spent 15 years erasing, facing a woman who had redirected his own mechanism against him using a capability he didn't know existed, facing a king who had, in a single night, done what Morvain's entire careful architecture had been designed to prevent. He stood in it, and then he said very quietly, "There's one more thing you don't know." Vaelor's eyes didn't move. "The 11 transports," Morvain said. "They're not separate. They were consolidated at 2 in the morning. One location, one transport, simpler to control than 3. The stand-down signal your healer sent will reach the facility administrators. It won't reach the transport." Seraphine got to her feet. "Because the transport isn't on an administrative channel," she said. No, Morvain said. "It's on a personal one. My personal one, which goes through a device that is not in my coat." He looked at her steadily. "If I don't send a confirmation by sunrise, the transport executes its alternative orders." "Which are?" Vaelor said. Morvain said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was the answer. Seraphine looked at the sky through the open eastern wall of the celestial sanctum. The gray was deepening, the first genuine light beginning to work its way up from the horizon, the specific color of a sky that was 4, perhaps 5 minutes from sunrise. 5 minutes. 11 people. One man standing in the ruins with nothing left to lose and a final piece of leverage he was holding with both hands. She looked at Vaelor. He looked at her. There was something in that exchange that required no words. A recognition, a shared landing on the same understanding at the same moment, the particular alignment of 2 people who have been working in the same direction long enough that the distance between their thoughts has compressed to almost nothing. This was the moment that everything had been moving toward. Not the arrest, not the documentation, not the careful legal architecture that would dismantle the institutional network over the months that followed. This, a space the size of 5 minutes, with 11 lives inside it, and a choice that no strategy and no patience and no properly filed documentation could make for them. Vaelor turned back to Morvain. "Here is what happens now," he said, and his voice had a quality it had not had before tonight. Not the voice of a king performing certainty, but the voice of a man who has passed through the version of himself that needed performance and come out on the other side into something simpler and harder. "You send the confirmation, not because I'm threatening you, not because you have anything to gain from it, but because in 30 years of running this operation, you have not once asked yourself what the people in those cells would choose if they had a choice. And I am giving you the opportunity, in the last moment where it's possible, to make one decision that isn't about control." Morvain looked at him, Then he looked at Seraphine. She held his gaze without flinching. She was tired, and her head was pounding from the resonance effort, and she could still feel the echo of what she'd touched in him, the fear running underneath everything like a river under ice. And she did not offer him sympathy or contempt, because neither was what this moment required. She offered him the only thing she had that he'd never encountered in 15 years of running his operation. She simply looked at him, honestly, as one human being at another, and waited. The sky was brightening. 3 minutes. Morvaine's hand went into his coat. He took out a second device. He held it in his palm and looked at it with the expression of a man looking at something that has been the center of his operational world for a long time and is about to cease to be. Seraphine held her breath. 2 minutes. Vaelor didn't move, didn't speak, didn't pressure. This was, she understood, its own kind of discipline, the hardest kind, the discipline of a man who has done everything he can do and is now standing in the space where the outcome belongs to someone else, holding that space without collapsing into it. The sky at the eastern wall was gold now, the specific gold of the last moment before the sun clears the horizon, and the celestial sanctum's broken stone caught it and held it, and the ruins of the birthplace of her people were, for 1 minute, genuinely beautiful. Morvaine pressed the button. The device blinked once. Confirmed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seraphine had heard in 15 years. Vaelor's eyes closed for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and looked at Orin, who had appeared at the outer entrance with her operational face fully in place, and he said, very quietly, "Get the transport location from that device. Now." Orin crossed the space in 6 steps and took the device from Morvaine's unresisting hand. Morvaine stood in the golden light of the celestial sanctum with the expression of a man who has just stepped out of an architecture he built around himself over 30 years and is experiencing, for the first time in a very long time, the unprotected sensation of open air. He looked old, not in years, in the specific way of someone from whom something load-bearing has been removed. Seraphine looked at him and thought about what her mother would have said. Her mother, who had been a healer for 40 years, and who had understood, as the deepest principle of everything she practiced, that the people who were most broken were usually the ones who had been most afraid, and that the appropriate response to fear was not victory over it, but something harder, the long, deliberate work of offering an alternative. She was not ready to do that work with this man today, but she understood that the work existed. That was enough for now. Orin looked up from the device. She met Vaelor's eyes across the ruins, and her face had the expression of someone delivering information they have been waiting a long time to deliver. "I have the location," she said. Vaelor looked at Seraphine. She was already moving. The transport was a covered vehicle moving along the eastern road out of the capital, and it stopped when the rider Orin dispatched reached it with the confirmed stand-down order, and the 11 people inside it emerged into the early morning light of a road lined with autumn trees that had no knowledge of what they were witnessing, and Seraphine stood at the edge of the road and watched them come out one by one. She did not know their faces. She did not know their names. She knew what they were, and she felt it, the resonance of 11 Luminar survivors in proximity, a frequency she had not felt since she was 17 years old in a world that had not yet ended, a chord she had believed for most of her adult life she would never hear again. She stood in the road and she breathed it in, and she did not try to manage what it did to her face. Vaelor stood slightly behind her and slightly to her left, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Because this was not a moment that required words from him. It required only his presence, the confirmation that he was there, that what had happened tonight had produced this specific morning, this road, these 11 people. He had said direction of travel. She had said that was the honest version. She understood now that he had meant it the way a man means something when he is willing to burn everything comfortable about his current position to keep moving in that direction. She turned and looked at him. He looked back. The sun was fully up now, the autumn trees throwing long shadows across the road, the light the specific gold of early morning that makes the ordinary world look, briefly, like itself. "There's still Isara," she said. "I know. Whatever she did to survive, whatever she became, that's not finished." "No. She's going to be angry at me, at you, at everything the Empire represents, and the anger isn't going to be clean or simple or something that resolves in a conversation." "I know," he said. "Are you prepared for that?" He looked at her with the expression she now had a name for. She'd been working toward the name for 3 days, and it had arrived this morning in the light on this road. It was the expression of a person who has decided to be accountable for what they cannot fully predict and is making that decision without flinching from its cost. "Are you?" he said. She looked at the 11 people on the road. She looked at the Capitol behind them, its towers catching the morning light. She thought about Lysera in the Citadel, sharp-edged and dense, and carrying 15 years of something that was not going to dissolve simply because the cell door had been opened. She thought about what it was going to take. She thought, I don't know if I'm enough for this. She thought, I'm going to find out. Yes, she said, and behind them, from the direction of the Capitol, a rider was already coming at speed. Orange signal, which could only mean one thing, which could only mean that the next thing was already in motion, that the morning was not a resolution but a threshold, that the cost Vaelor had said a crown carried was not yet finished being paid. The rider pulled up hard, breathing fast. Sire, looking at Vaelor with the specific expression of someone delivering a message that changes the shape of everything. It's Lysera. She's gone. She left the Citadel an hour ago. A pause during which the road and the trees and the morning light all held exactly still. And she took the research logs with her. Seraphine went cold. Vaelor turned to look at her. She looked back. They both understood in the same moment, with the same terrible clarity, what taking the research logs meant, not the legal implications, not the evidentiary complications, but what it meant about the state of the person who had taken them. What it meant about what Lysera Vale had decided. In the hour after the cell door opened and the king had gone to the sanctum and she had been left alone in a room in the Citadel with nothing but her own architecture and 15 years of what had been done to her and done through her. She had not run. Running was what you did when you wanted to be somewhere safe. Lysera Vale. Seraphine understood with certainty that sat in the body rather than the mind, was not looking for somewhere safe. She was looking for somewhere to finish what she'd started. The research logs. Seraphine stood on this autumn road and understood what that meant the way you understand the ground shifting beneath your feet. Not as a concept, but as a physical reality that reorganizes everything around it. Lysera had not taken the logs because she was afraid of what they contained. She had taken them because she knew exactly what they contained, because she had built them, piece by piece, across 15 years of deliberate and costly work. And she had decided that the person who got to decide what happened to them next was not a king, not a legal process, and not a sister who had been free while she was not. It was her. Vaelor was already turning back to the rider. Which direction? East Road, sire, toward the Varath borderlands. She requisitioned a horse from the Citadel's secondary stable, used the access Commander Oren granted her last night. Seraphine looked at the 11 people standing in the road, still blinking in the morning light, still calibrating to the fact of open sky. One of them was sitting on the ground with her knees pulled up and her forehead resting on them, and another was standing with his face tilted up toward the sun with his eyes closed. And none of them were doing anything that looked like urgency, because urgency required a sense of future, and they were all still adjusting to the fact that they had one. She could not leave them here. She also could not let Lysera reach the borderlands with the logs. The borderlands were not empty territory. They were the edge of the Empire's control, the fraying margin where the administrative authority thinned, and the old factional networks that predated Vaelor's reign still operated in the spaces between official structures. A woman with 15 years of alchemical research, a detailed understanding of Luminar weaponized knowledge, and a specific and unresolved relationship with the concept of vengeance would find, in the borderlands, exactly the kind of infrastructure that would help her use what she was carrying. Seraphine looked at Vaelor. He was looking at her. I'll go, she said. Not alone. She won't respond to soldiers. You said that yourself, the first night. I said you said that. And it's still true. He held her gaze. But I said not alone, not send soldiers. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment. You have 11 people standing on a road who just came out of a transport vehicle, she said. Oren will handle that. Oren handles everything I ask her to handle, which is why I have trusted her for 20 years. He looked at the rider. 2 horses. Now. The rider turned back toward the city. Seraphine looked at the 11 survivors once more. The woman with her forehead on her knees had lifted her head and was looking at Seraphine with eyes that were still adjusting, still finding the edges of the world. And Seraphine crossed to her and crouched down and said quietly, "You're safe. The woman coming to help you is named Orin, and she is the most competent person in this empire, and she will take care of everything until I return." She paused. "I have something I need to finish first." The woman looked at her. Her voice when it came was rough from disuse and rough from everything else. "Is it your sister?" "Yes." "She was in a different facility. I never met her." A pause. "But we heard about her. The one who was documenting, the one who was holding the map." Her jaw tightened. Tell her that what she built kept people alive in there, because we knew eventually someone would come with the map." Seraphine felt those words move through her in the specific way of things that are true and painful and necessary simultaneously. She pressed her hand briefly over the woman's and stood. Orin appeared at the road's edge. Seraphine met her eyes and Orin gave a single nod, which contained everything it needed to contain. The horses arrived. They rode east. The autumn road ran through a corridor of trees whose leaves were the amber and copper of a season in its ending, and the morning light came through them at an angle that was beautiful in the completely indifferent way of natural things. And Seraphine rode without paying attention to any of it because she was running everything she knew about Lysara through her mind at speed, trying to find the version of her sister that was navigating this specific situation with these specific tools and this specific wound, and trying to understand what that version was heading toward. The wound was the part that mattered. Not the 15 years. That was the container, not the content. The wound was the specific moment, repeated across 15 years, of choosing to go on. The choice that survival always asked for and that nobody talked about honestly. Not the dramatic choice, the binary choice of endure or collapse, but the smaller, more corrosive choice that happened every morning, every hour, in every small decision about whether to cooperate and what to give, and how much of yourself to convert into something useful to the people holding you. The accumulated cost of that choice was not simple, and it was not clean, and it did not resolve when the cell door opened. It became available. That was the danger. Not that Lysara was broken. Seraphine understood now that her sister was not broken in the simple sense, had in fact maintained a structural integrity that was extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. The danger was that 15 years of accumulated cost had become, in the moment of freedom, a resource, fuel for something. And the question of what Lysara intended to fuel with it was what Seraphine had been unable to fully answer since the cell door opened. "Tell me about her," Vaelor said. He was riding slightly behind her and slightly to the right, which was the position of someone who was present but not leading, and she had not asked him to take that position, but he had taken it, which told her something she filed away without examining directly. "Before or after?" she said. "Before." She thought about that for a moment, the road unspooled beneath them, the trees going past. "She laughed easily," Seraphine said. "That was the thing I remembered most, in the years when I was trying to hold on to her. She found things funny that I took seriously, and she was usually right to find them funny. She was lighter than me. Not less intelligent, not less capable. Just lighter. Like she hadn't yet learned to carry everything as weight." A pause. "She would have been a remarkable healer. She already was, at 15. The resonance sensitivity she had, I've never encountered it in anyone else. It was like she could feel things at a distance that I had to be in contact with to read. And after?" Seraphine was quiet for a long beat. "She still laughs," she said. "I heard it once in the Citadel before I realized what I was hearing. Brief. At something Orin said walking past the room, sharp and real." A pause. "She's still in there. That's the part I have to hold on to. She's still in there, and everything else that she's become is built around that, not over it." Vaelor said nothing. He simply rode. She was grateful for that, for the silence that held the shape of what she'd said without requiring anything of it. They had been riding for 20 minutes when she saw the smoke. It rose from the tree line a quarter-mile ahead. Not the heavy black smoke of destruction, but the gray-white of something controlled, contained, a fire that had been built deliberately rather than accidentally. And with it, carried on the morning air. a smell that made her hands tighten on the reins. Burned paper, burned leather, research logs. She looked at Vaelor. He was already looking at her. They rode toward the smoke. Lysara had chosen a clearing set back from the road, invisible unless you knew to leave the path. She had built the fire with the methodical efficiency of someone who had thought about this specific act for a very long time. The research logs, 15 years of compiled documentation in 2 leather satchels, the accumulated forced record of everything Morvain had extracted from her, were burning in a pile at the center of the clearing, and she was sitting on a fallen log 6 feet away, watching them burn with an expression that was not satisfaction exactly, not relief exactly, but something that contained both and contained neither. She looked up when they entered the clearing. She did not look surprised. She looked at Seraphine first, then at Vaelor, then back at the fire. "You should have sent soldiers," she said. I would have moved faster." "I'm not here to stop you," Seraphine said. A pause. Lysara looked at her with those flat, dense eyes, assessing. "The logs are most of them are gone." "I know. You needed them for the prosecution. We have enough without them. Oren's team pulled the facility operational records and Morvain's authorization signatures. The research content was..." Seraphine paused. "It was yours. What happened to it was your call." Something moved in Lysara's face, fractional, controlled. She looked back at the fire. "Sit down," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, the way she said most things, as a statement of available options. Seraphine sat on the ground near the fire. Vaelor remained standing at the edge of the clearing, which she understood he had chosen deliberately, which she understood was the specific intelligence of a man who grasped that this was not his conversation to anchor. The fire burned. The last of the leather covers curled and blackened and went to ash. "Why east?" Seraphine said. "Because it was away," Lysara said. "And then I thought about where away led, and I stopped." "What made you stop?" A long pause. The fire made its sounds, the particular quiet violence of paper giving up its structure. "I got to the edge of the road and I thought about what I was going to do when I reached the borderlands," Lysara said. "I had a clear image of it. The contacts, the networks, the people who would find the logs useful. I've been building that image for years, not consciously, not as a plan exactly, more as a fallback, a version of the future that existed if nothing else did." She looked at the ash. "And then I thought about the 11 people on that transport, and I thought about building a weapon that would hurt people who look like them." Seraphine was very still. "Not just alphas," Lysara said. "Anyone in the radius, anyone without the bloodline distinction that the compound required. The logs included 3 years of modifications that Morvain requested specifically to remove that distinction." Her voice was entirely flat. He wanted a weapon that didn't care about lineage. He wanted something that would create the kind of chaos that would require the kind of response that would consolidate the kind of power he was building toward. "Just..." She paused. "I gave him the documentation. I gave him almost everything he asked for." Another pause, longer. "Almost." "The resonance redirect," Seraphine said quietly. "The capability I used at the sanctum. It wasn't in the logs." "No. You withheld it." "I withheld several things. Over 15 years I withheld enough that what he had was a very detailed and largely functional partial picture, sufficient for what he'd been building, insufficient for anything he hadn't anticipated." Lysara's jaw was tight. "The problem with being used as a resource is that you have to let it be convincing. You have to give enough to be credible. And every time I gave something, I had to decide whether this was the piece that crossed a line I hadn't drawn clearly enough yet." She looked at the ash. "I drew the lines imprecisely. Some of what I gave him is going to hurt people. The compounds he built are already in circulation, small quantities. We don't know where." Her voice was the voice of someone stating facts they have been sitting with for a long time and have found no way to resolve. "That's the thing I can't burn." The fire was almost gone, just the ember bed now, pulsing orange in the morning air. Seraphine looked at her sister across the heat. She thought about what she had said on the autumn road. She's still in there. She had meant it as comfort, as the thing she was holding on to. Sitting here now, she understood it differently. It was not comfort. It was the actual truth, which was more complicated than comfort. Lysera was still in there. The girl who laughed easily was still inside this person who had spent 15 years making precise, costly decisions about what to give and what to withhold in a 10x8 cell. And those two things were not separate. The lightness and the hardness were the same person at different stages of the same life. And the question was not which one was real. They were both real. That was what made this difficult. That was also Seraphine was beginning to understand what made it possible. The compounds in circulation, Seraphine said. Do you know who received them? No, I know the distribution contacts Morvain used. Names, designations, it's in my head. That's information Vaelor needs. I know. Lysera looked at Vaelor across the clearing. He had not moved, had not spoken, had simply held his position with the patience of someone who understood that some conversations needed space that was not shaped by their presence. Lysera looked at him for a long moment. You closed 6 facilities 4 years ago. Yes, Vaelor said. What happened to the people in them? A pause. He answered it directly, which she had, Seraphine noticed, come to expect from him. Varied outcomes. Some were released and received support through the Empire's compensation structures. Some were in conditions that required extended care. Some, he stopped. Some we were too late for. How many too late? He told her the number. Lysera absorbed it. The 6 facilities you closed, she said. Were you aware of mine? No. Why not? Because it was hidden more carefully than the others, and because the people who ran it had better institutional protection, and because I was not looking in precisely the right place. He paused. There is no version of that answer that is sufficient. I am telling you the operational facts. The moral accounting is different, and I am not asking you to accept it. Lysera looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she had in the cell. The full, precise assessment of someone whose instruments were calibrated by 15 years of needing to be right about people in conditions where being wrong had immediate and serious consequences. You're not asking me to trust you, she said. No. You're not offering me anything. I'm not in a position to offer you what you're actually owed. Nobody is. What I can do is the work that comes next, which I intend to do regardless of whether you believe me. Tool, he paused. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to do that work alongside me. Not for me. For the 11 people on that road who are going to need somewhere to exist in an empire that has not yet made room for them. For whatever other survivors we find. For the question of what comes after justice, which is harder than justice and takes longer and is the part that most kings never reach. Lysera said nothing. She looked at the ash. She pressed her hands together between her knees, a gesture Seraphine recognized suddenly from a very long time ago, from a girl who did it when she was thinking hard about something, when she was running through the full structure of a problem before committing to a response, and she breathed. Then she said, "The distribution contacts, I'll give them to you." Vaelor nodded once. "And the other things I withheld from the logs, the capabilities Morvain never mapped." She looked at her own hands. "Some of it is healing, some of it is not. You'll need to know the difference if you're going to protect people from what's already out there." "I'll need you to explain the difference," Vaelor said. "I'll need Seraphine to help me understand it, and I'll need time and better information than I had before last night." "You'll get things wrong," Lysera said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of operational reality. "Yes. And when you do, tell me." His voice was even. "I will listen." Something happened in Lysera's face that was not the resolution of anything. Nothing that 15 years and a morning in a clearing could resolve was going to resolve this morning, but was the beginning of a different configuration. The beginning of a position that was not the cell, not the fallback plan she'd been building in her head, but something that existed in the space between those things, something that did not yet have a name. She stood. She looked at Seraphine, and Seraphine looked back at her sister in the ash-gray morning light of a clearing in the East Road tree line, and she felt the full weight of all the years that had passed between them. The years of not knowing, the years of building a life at Millward Bridge on top of the foundation of not knowing, the years of carrying the not knowing, distributed through her bones so that no single part of her bore the full load. And she felt all of it, and she did not try to resolve it, because some weights did not resolve. They became structural. They became part of what you were built from. She crossed the clearing and she put her arms around her sister. Lysera did not move at first. For 3 seconds, she simply stood in the embrace with the stillness of someone who has forgotten what this felt like and is recalibrating its speed. Then her arms came up. She held on with the specific grip of someone who had been in a 10-by-8 cell for 15 years and understood, in the body rather than the mind, that the person they were holding was real and present and not a thing they had constructed in memory to make the days survivable. They stood in the clearing. The last of the fire gave out. The smoke drifted east on a morning wind that was cold and clean and indifferent and entirely real. Vaelor stood at the edge of the clearing and looked away, because some things did not require a witness, and the wisdom of knowing the difference was one of the things that the crown had cost him a long time ago, and that he had been grateful for ever since. They rode back to the capital in the late morning. Lysera rode slightly ahead, which was not hostility but orientation. She was relearning the experience of choosing her own direction and needed the physical fact of it. Vaelor and Seraphine rode together, and the space between their horses was close enough for conversation, and neither of them was talking, which was a different thing from silence. It was the quality of shared presence that had nothing left to prove. The capital appeared at the road's horizon, and they rode toward it, and Seraphine thought about what it would mean to enter it now. Not as the gray healer of Millward Bridge, not as the person who had survived by becoming invisible, not as the last of anything, which was a designation she was only now fully understanding she had been carrying as an identity rather than just a fact, the way people sometimes mistake the container for the content. She was still the last trained Luminar practitioner in the full sense of the tradition. That was true and would remain true for years, until she had taught what she knew to people who could carry it forward, which was work that was now possible where it had not been before, which was the specific quality of the morning she was riding into. Not restored, changed. The distinction mattered. Restoration implied a return to something prior, a rewinding of the years toward a before. What had happened was not that. The before was gone. The family, the home, the world in which her people's knowledge was practiced openly and without fear. That world did not come back. What came instead was a new world that had space in it, that was being made to have space in it, that would require decades of continued making, and that was built not on the before, but on the full account of everything that had happened since. That was different from restoration. That was something harder and more durable. She thought about her mother's morning blessing, the tablet she had lost in the Millward fire. She thought about the 3 lines in Tessely's imperfect pronunciation, carried for 6 years in a girl's memory because her grandmother had taught her that some things were worth the effort of carrying. She would write it again. She had the whole of it in her memory, every line, the full text her mother had said every morning, without exception. She would write it in the script her people had carried for generations, and she would teach it to the people who wanted to learn it, and it would not be the same as having the original. Nothing was the same as the original. But it would be real, and it would be forward-pointing, which was the only direction available. Vaelor said beside her, "What are you thinking?" She said, "That I need paper and a pen." He looked at her sideways with that expression she now had a name for, and said, "I believe the map room has both." "The map room?" she said. "It's a good room," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, but something in the set of his face had a quality she recognized from the early hours of the morning they'd come through together. Not the king performing certainty, but the man underneath the king, who was tired and had spent a night doing something that had cost him a recognizable amount, and was riding into the work of the next thing without putting down what the previous thing had been. This was, she understood, what he was. Not the image, not the 47 territories and the iron nerve and the scar from Ireth Crossing. The man who rode toward the next thing without putting down the weight of the last one, because he had understood early that the weight was not the problem. It was the material. She thought about the first night, when he had looked at her across a banquet hall floor with the candles burning low and whispered her true name in a way that had made her understand, before she was ready to understand it, that something had shifted in the architecture of her life. She thought about the version of herself who had arrived in that hall. 15 years of careful, costly self-erasure, a woman who had become so expert at not being seen that she had almost succeeded in not seeing herself. She thought about what it had taken to make her visible again. Not a rescue, not a protection, though those things were real and had mattered. Something more specific. The experience of being in a room with a person who looked at her and adjusted their understanding of the world to include what they saw, rather than adjusting what they saw to fit their prior understanding of the world. She had done that for him too, she thought, or tried to. In the map room, in the corridor, in the celestial sanctum, with her hands against the stone and every frequency she had open and running. She had seen the thing he was building himself toward, not the king he had been, but the king he was working to become. And she had aligned with it the way luminar healing aligned with damaged systems. Not fixing, but accompanying. Not solving, but holding the frequency steady long enough for the person to find their own way back. This was what she had, she thought, that the compound texts did not contain. Not the technical capability, the intention behind it. The understanding that power and care were not opposing forces. That strength expressed as domination was a lesser thing than strength expressed as responsibility. That the most durable structures were not the ones that could not be broken, but the ones that could absorb breakage and continue to hold their essential shape. She had learned this from her mother. Her mother had paid for the teaching with her life. Seraphine intended to make that payment count for something, but the capital received them. Not with ceremony. This was not a triumphant return, but a working morning. And the capital was a city of several million people running their routines in the large, indifferent way of cities, without particular awareness of what had transpired in a sanctum and a clearing in the East Road tree line while they were sleeping. That was, Seraphine thought, exactly right. The city's indifference was not a failure of understanding, but a feature of scale. The change that had happened would work its way through this place over years, through institutions and policies, and the slow reorientation of a culture's relationship to its own history, and most of the people living those years would experience it not as a single dramatic event, but as an accumulated texture, a gradual shift in what was possible. A world that looked slightly different in the morning than it had the morning before, and then slightly different again, until one day someone looked back and said, "This is not what it was." That was how lasting change happened. Not in clearings, not in sanctums, in the daily practice of people choosing, repeatedly and at ordinary cost, to build towards something other than what already existed. Morvain was in custody. The council members were suspended pending the investigation that Oren had already begun to document with the thoroughness she applied to all things. Aldrich, Seraphine had been told this quietly by Oren as they entered the capital's outer gate, had presented himself for questioning before the arrest order reached him, which was either the act of a man attempting to control his own narrative or the act of a man who had spent 22 years in service to a king and found, at the end, that he could not make himself run. She did not know which, perhaps both. She thought about 22 years. She thought about what a betrayal looked like from inside it. The slow accumulation of small choices, the first compromise that could be rationalized, and the second, and the 10th, and the point at which the compromises were no longer conscious choices, but had become the architecture of the person making them. She did not offer Aldrich mercy in her heart this morning, but she understood the mechanism because she had lived adjacent to it, had felt, in her own years of survival, the pull toward choices that would have made her survival cleaner at the cost of making her something she did not want to be. The difference between her and Aldrich was not virtue. It was the specific set of things each of them had decided were worth protecting. She had decided the work was worth protecting. The knowledge, the capability to heal, the possibility that she might someday find her sister. He had decided something else. That was the only accounting she had. The map room was exactly as they had left it. The paper was still on the table where she had been writing when Oren came for her in the night. The pen was where she'd set it. The script she'd been writing was dry now, the characters precisely formed, the line of her mother's blessing preserved in the exact curve of the letters her mother had used. She sat down. She picked up the pen. She began, not with the blessing, but with something else. The full text, the whole of what she carried, the accumulated knowledge of a tradition that had existed in her alone for 15 years and was now going to exist somewhere else as well. Not on hidden tablets under floorboards, not in encrypted fragments carried in tin boxes. On paper, in a room, in a building that was now, Formally, legally, on record, a place where this writing was not a crime, but a protected practice. She wrote for a long time. Vaelor came and went. There were things requiring his attention, a morning's worth of institutional reckoning that did not pause for clearings or quiet rooms. And each time he passed through, he moved without disturbing her, bringing coffee at some point that she did not remember drinking but found empty beside her hand, and this was, she thought, also something she had not known she needed. The simple ordinary fact of a person moving through a space with consideration for what she was doing in it. Lysara came in around midday. She stood at the door and looked at the pages spread across the table and was quiet for a moment. "The morning blessing," she said. She recognized it. "And the resonance principles, the healing frameworks, everything I have that can be taught." Seraphine looked up. "I'm going to need help with the sections from the Southern tradition. You had more access to those texts than I did." Lysara crossed to the table and looked at the pages without sitting. She read several lines in silence. Her jaw moved slightly, the way it moved when she was processing something that bypassed the mind and went directly to the body. "You're rebuilding the archive," she said, "from what we have. It won't be complete." "No," Seraphine said. "It'll be what it is, which is different from nothing." Lysara was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. "The Southern tradition sections," she said. "Where do you want to start?" Seraphine slid a blank page across the table. She slid the pen. Lysara picked it up. They worked. The afternoon moved through the windows in the specific way of autumn afternoons. The light golden and lateral, the shadows long, the quality of warmth provisional, like something on loan from a season already departing. The map room held it, and the two women at the table held it, and the pages accumulated with the slow weight of things being recovered from near total loss. Vaelor came in at the end of the afternoon. He did not interrupt. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at what was on the table and at the two women working, and his expression was the expression of a man encountering something he has been working toward for 7 years, and finding that the reality of it is nothing like what he had imagined, and better, in a way he does not yet have language for. Seraphine looked up. He said, "Morvaine's testimony is being processed. The council members are cooperating, all 4 of them, separately, under the understanding that cooperation has different consequences than its alternative. The distribution contacts Lysara provided are being mapped. We'll find most of what's in circulation within the month." "Most," she said. "Most is what honest looks like," he said. I'm done telling you more than most." She held his gaze. "The 11, she said. "Where are they?" "Here, for now. The East Wing has been opened. Oren is managing the immediate situation, and I have a longer conversation to have with all of them about what comes next, which is a conversation I am not going to have without you and without Lysara, because what comes next is not something I can design unilaterally and should not." "Good answer," Lysara said, without looking up from the page she was writing. Something crossed Vaelor's face that was, in the right light, something that might have been the ghost of a genuine smile. Not performed, not public, but the kind of expression that arrives when a person has spent a long time carrying something very heavy and looks up and finds themselves, without having planned for it, somewhere they did not expect to reach. Seraphine recognized it. She had worn it herself, this morning on a road with 11 people blinking in the early light. She stood and crossed the room to where he was standing, and she was aware of Lysara at the table with her pen, and she was aware of the afternoon light, and the pages, and the weight of the day that had begun in the dark of a sanctum and come through a clearing and arrived here. And she looked at Vaelor Thorne and said, "What do you need?" He looked at her for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "Not right now." She understood then this was true, and also that it was the most significant thing he had said to her, because the king who had summoned her on the night of the poisoning had needed something. Protection, survival, a resource he could leverage against the problem in front of him. The man standing in the map room doorway did not need anything from her that she was not already choosing to give. That was a different proposition entirely. She said, "Then sit down. There's a lot left to write, and Lysara says the southern sections are extensive." He sat down. He did not pick up a pen. He did not pretend to a knowledge he didn't have. He sat at the edge of the table and he listened as the two sisters worked, and he learned, and the afternoon went on. Years later, not many, but enough, Vaelor stood on the balcony of the citadel's eastern tower and watched the capital that had changed beneath him. Not transformed. Change of the kind that mattered was never transformation. It was not the sudden revelation of a new world, but the slow, expensive, frequently interrupted work of building one, day by day, in the spaces between the forces that did not want it built. The Luminar Academies had been open for 2 years. 17 students in the first cohort, 9 in the second. Not all of them were Luminar descendants. The academies were open to anyone with the capacity and the commitment, which was a principle that Seraphine had insisted on from the beginning, because knowledge hoarded was knowledge that would be lost again eventually. And the point was not to restore a lineage, but to make the understanding available in a form the world could use. Lysara taught the advanced resonance work. She was not warm. She had not become warm, and she was not going to become warm. And Seraphine had stopped expecting warmth and had instead found something she valued more: precision, honesty, the specific reliability of a person who said exactly what they meant without ornamentation, who had looked at the worst of what she had been through and had decided to make it useful rather than pretend it hadn't happened. She was, Vaelor thought, one of the most extraordinary people he had encountered in 41 years of encountering people. And he told her this once, directly, and she had looked at him and said, "I know," and gone back to what she was doing. He had found that enormously refreshing. The compounds that had gotten into circulation, they had found most of them. Not all. This was the weight he would carry forward, the not all, the knowledge that something he had not moved fast enough to prevent was still distributed somewhere in the world's understructure, waiting for a moment that might not come but could not be declared impossible. He had made his peace with that. The way he made his peace with all the things that fell into the category of things he had done wrong and could not undo, fully, directly, without comfort or mitigation, and then forward. Morvain had been prosecuted and sentenced and had served 2 years of that sentence before dying of a heart condition at 62 years old in the institutional care facility where he had been held. He had died in a room smaller than the one Lysara had occupied for 15 years, which Vaelor did not find satisfying and did not find insufficient either. He found it true, which was the only category that still reliably mattered to him. He heard footsteps behind him. Seraphine came to stand beside him at the balcony railing and looked out at the capital the way she looked at most things, directly, without the intermediary of performance or distance. He had come to understand over years of close proximity, fundamentally uninterested in the versions of things that existed primarily to make other people comfortable. She wanted the actual thing, the actual person, the actual situation. This had made her, in the context of a court that ran largely on performed versions of everything, occasionally difficult and consistently necessary. He had relied on her judgment for 3 years now, in contexts that ranged from medical to political to the specifically human negotiations that empire required at its edges, the places where policy and person collided and needed someone who could read both. He had loved her in the way that was not simple and had not arrived cleanly and had been built rather than found, for longer than he had admitted it to himself, and for precisely the length of time he had admitted it to her. "Lysara is asking about the northern outpost," she said. "Tell her the building is approved. The site selection is her call. She'll want to hear that from you." "I know. I'll tell her tonight." He looked at the city. How are the second cohort settling? Better than the first. The first was starting from zero. No framework, no precedent, no established understanding of what we were even trying to do. The second cohort arrived with a tradition already in motion, which changes what's possible. She paused. One of them has resonant sensitivity comparable to what Lysara had at 15. He looked at her. "I know," she said, and her voice had a quality he recognized, the quality of something that was joy and grief and the future all pressing from the same direction simultaneously, a convergence of things that were too large for simple emotion and too real for abstraction. He put his hand over hers on the railing. She did not move her hand away. They stood in the late afternoon light and looked at the city they had not built. No one builds a city. Cities are accumulated, but had bent, slowly and at significant cost, in a direction that was better than the direction it had been going. That was the accurate version. Not salvation, not transformation. The accurate version, which was also the durable version, was that a king who had been willing to break his own most comfortable assumptions had done the work that breaking required, and a woman who had survived by becoming invisible had chosen, on a specific night in a banquet hall, to be visible in a way that could not be taken back. And the collision of those two choices had produced years of difficult, imperfect, necessary work that was not finished and would not be finished in any single lifetime, but was pointed in the right direction of travel. She had said it first, with the careful skepticism of someone who had been offered less than enough too many times to accept inadequate consolations. He had said it with the understanding of a man who meant it as a commitment rather than a reassurance. They had both been right. They had both been tested against what they meant. And here, at the far end of a story that had begun with a poison in a goblet and a woman choosing not to let a man die in his own banquet hall, they were standing on a balcony in the late light of a day that was ordinary and real and built from the material of all the days that had come before it, the hard ones and the costly ones, and the ones where the right choice had no clean answer, and the city spread below them into the horizon, full of lives running their routines with no particular awareness of what it had taken to make the world they were running them in. That was exactly right. That was how it should be. The work done well became invisible. The foundations held without announcing themselves. The change that lasted was the kind that no longer needed to be dramatic, that had become structural, that was simply the shape of how things were. Vaelor looked at the city. He thought about his father's empire, the one he had inherited, built on fear and maintained by it, a structure designed to outlast the people inside it by making itself necessary through their dependence. He thought about the empire he had been building instead, slower, more contested, more expensive in every way that mattered, requiring him at every juncture to choose the harder thing rather than the effective thing when they were different, which they often were. He thought about what a king was for, not the version from the histories, the conqueror, the consolidator, the man who imposed order on chaos through force of will and superior force of arms. That version had its uses and its place and its specific historical necessity in conditions he had lived through and did not romanticize. But the version that outlasted the histories, the version that got remembered not as a tactical success, but as something that had mattered to the actual texture of people's actual lives, that version was built from a different material. From the willingness to be wrong and say so. From the willingness to inherit accountability for things you had not done and had not chosen. From the specific discipline of power that understood its own tendency toward self-preservation and worked against it continuously, not once, not in a dramatic gesture, but in the ordinary daily practice of asking whose interest was actually being served and whether the answer was acceptable. From love, which was not the opposite of strength, which was, in the end, what strength was for. He turned from the railing. "Come inside," he said. "The work isn't finished." Seraphine looked at him with those pale, steady eyes. "It never is," she said. "No," he said. She pushed off from the railing and went inside, and he followed, and the door to the balcony closed behind them, and the city went on in the late afternoon light, running its ordinary life in the ordinary way of people who were living in a world that was, incrementally and imperfectly and at significant cost, getting better. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.